strip away the gold. Before the legend, before Gloriana, before the Virgin Queen, before the jeweled icon that 4 centuries have agreed to call the greatest of England's monarchs, there was an old woman in a shuttered room, and she would not look in a glass. By the end of her life, the face that all of Europe thought it knew had become a thing built fresh each morning like plaster. First a paste of white lead ground in vinegar, a cosmetic called ceruse, spread thick to bury the scars a near-fatal smallpox had left on her decades before. Over it, color. Above it, a wig of red gold, the shade of a youth long gone. And behind the painted lips, by the report of a French ambassador who was granted audiences in her old age, a mouth of teeth gone black with decay. A poet of the next reign would claim that in her final years the queen kept no true mirror in her rooms at all, that her women painted her, and she never once saw the truth of what she had become. We cannot be certain that last story is true, but we can be certain of what it means and why it has lasted, because the story of Elizabeth I is, before anything else, the story of a mask, a golden image deliberately built that the world has mistaken for the woman ever since. The woman beneath it was formidable and clever and brave. She was also something the legend has worked very hard to hide. Secretive, frightened, ferociously controlling, scarred in her body and in her memory. She survived a childhood of terror. She ruled through a web of spies and the edge of the axe. She agonized over, and then ordered, the killing of a fellow queen, and, at the very end, of the young man she had loved above all others. The gold is the story the palace wanted you to believe. This is the other one. Elizabeth I was far darker than history admits. To understand the woman who would spend her whole life building the golden mask of Gloriana, you must first understand the terror that lay beneath it, and that terror was written into her cradle before she was old enough to speak a single word. She was born on the 7th of September, 1533, in the Palace of Placentia at Greenwich, on the river below London, and she was a disappointment before she was anything else. Her father was Henry VIII, King of England. Her mother was his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And to marry Anne, Henry had done nothing less than break the whole of England away from the Roman Catholic Church, defy the Pope himself, set aside his first wife of some 20 years, and overturn the faith of his kingdom, all in the fierce conviction that Anne would give him the one thing he wanted above the peace of his own soul: a legitimate son, a male heir, a boy to secure his dynasty against the chaos of a disputed succession. He had gambled his kingdom and his conscience on it. The physicians and the astrologers had assured him it would be a prince, and the long-awaited child, when it came at last into the world at Greenwich, was a girl. The disappointment was public, and it was bitter. The grand tournament that had been prepared to celebrate the birth of a prince was quietly set aside, and the letters written out in advance to announce the child to the kingdom, it is said, had been drafted to proclaim a prince, so that a clerk was left to crowd in an extra letter by hand and make the word read princess. Henry had been promised a son. He had been given a daughter, and beneath all the ceremony of a royal christening, the court understood exactly what that meant. For a little while, it hardly seemed to matter. The infant was a princess, first in line to the throne, cherished and richly kept, and there would surely be sons to follow. But there were no sons, and Anne Boleyn had enemies at the English court as sharp and as patient as any in Europe, men who had never wanted her and who watched and waited as the king's ardor cooled and no prince arrived. Less than 3 years after Elizabeth's birth, the marriage that had convulsed a continent came apart with a speed and a savagery that stunned everyone who witnessed it. In the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested at Greenwich and carried to the Tower of London. The charges laid against her were monstrous: adultery with 5 different men, one of them her own brother, an accusation of incesty and conspiracy to bring about the death of the king. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, an engine built by her enemies to destroy a queen who had failed in her one essential task. Historians down the centuries have overwhelmingly judged her innocent of all of it. It made no difference whatsoever. She was tried, she was condemned, and on the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on the green within the Tower walls by a swordsman brought over specially from Calais for the purpose. Her daughter, the Lady Elizabeth, was 2 years and 8 months old. And this is the single fact that sits beneath every other fact of Elizabeth's life, the shadow under all the gold that would come after. Her father had ordered her mother's head to be struck from her body. With the mother went the daughter's entire place in the world. Within days, the marriage was declared to have been no true marriage at all, which made the child of it no true princess. By an Act of Parliament, the Second Succession Act of 1536, the little girl was pronounced illegitimate and struck out of the line of succession to the throne of England. She was no longer the Princess Elizabeth. At not yet 3 years old, she was demoted to merely the Lady Elizabeth, a king's bastard daughter, and her household was cut down to match her fallen station. There survives, from this time, a letter written by the noblewoman who ran that household, Lady Bryan, to the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, a letter complaining, quite practically, that the child had outgrown every stitch she owned, that she had neither gown, nor kirtle, nor petticoat, and pleading with the court to send provision. In the space of a single spring, the daughter of a Queen of England had become a small girl, whom the court was no longer entirely sure how to clothe. What followed was a childhood lived on ground that never stopped shifting beneath her feet. Her father worked his way through wife after wife, and Elizabeth's own standing rose and fell with each of them, like a boat on an uncertain tide. Jane Seymour, the third wife, at last gave Henry the son he had broken his kingdom to obtain, the boy who would become King Edward VI, and then she died. There was Anne of Cleves, married and swiftly and coldly discarded. There was Catherine Howard, Elizabeth's own young cousin, who in 1542 was taken to the very same green within the Tower and beheaded, a second stepmother destroyed on the block before Elizabeth had reached the age of 10, a second queen, unmade by nothing more than the king's word. And then, at last, there was Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, clever, gentle, and learned, who alone outlived him. Through all of it, Elizabeth's own legal status remained a strange and precarious puzzle. In 1543, her father relented far enough to pass a third act of succession, restoring her to the line of inheritance behind her half-brother Edward and her elder half-sister Mary, and yet, tellingly, he never restored her legitimacy. In the strict eye of the law, she remained, for the whole of her life, a bastard who might nonetheless one day be crowned Queen of England. That contradiction, unwanted and yet royal, branded illegitimate and yet an heir to the throne, sat at the very center of who she was, and it never left her. She met it, as she would come to meet everything, with the one weapon that was entirely her own, her mind. Under a series of the finest humanist scholars of the age, first William Grindal, and then from about 1548 the celebrated Cambridge teacher Roger Ascham, Elizabeth received an education as demanding and as thorough as any given to a royal prince. She learned to read, write, and speak fluent Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She studied rhetoric and history and the scriptures, and by every account that survives, she was formidably, even alarmingly clever. Roger Ascham, who had schooled some of the sharpest minds of the age, wrote of his royal pupil with something close to wonder at the reach of her reading, the discipline of her study, and a judgment he thought remarkable in one so young. She read Greek and Latin with an ease that shamed grown scholars, and she would go on reading, translating, and honing that mind in the original tongues for the rest of her life. But the deepest lesson of her childhood was not one that any tutor set for her out of a book. It was the lesson of the scaffold and the shifting tide, that a queen could be destroyed by a charge conjured out of nothing but words, that a girl's whole place in the world could be erased by a single stroke of the royal pen, and that the only safety for a person balanced as precariously as she was lay in watchfulness, in patience, and in giving nothing at all away. She learned very young to guard her tongue and to keep her own counsel locked behind a still face. Many years later, as queen, she would choose for her personal motto 3 words of Latin that were the truest possible summary of that childhood: video et taceo, I see and I say nothing. She had mastered survival as a discipline long before she ever needed it as a ruler. Her father, Henry VIII, died in January of 1547 when Elizabeth was 13 years old. The crown passed to her half-brother, a boy of 9, now King Edward VI, and the true power passed to the ambitious men who would govern the kingdom in the child king's name. And Elizabeth herself, a fatherless girl of 13, brilliant and watchful and profoundly alone, was sent away to live in the household of the one member of her fractured family who had ever shown her genuine warmth, her last stepmother, the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. She was 13 years old, and she had been sent to live with the one stepmother who had ever shown her kindness, the clever, gentle Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. It should have been the safest place in the kingdom for a fatherless girl, a house of books and prayer and warmth, far from the deadly currents of the court. Instead, it would very nearly destroy her. For Catherine Parr had married again, with unseemly haste and in secret, and the man who now shared her roof was the most dangerous kind of man at any court. Charming, ambitious, reckless, and hungry for a power he had no right to hold. He would begin to appear at the young princess's bedchamber in the grey hush before dawn. And within 2 years, what happened in that house would end with a man on the scaffold, the girl herself under brutal interrogation, and the first great lesson of Elizabeth's life carved into her forever, that love was a trap, and that the people closest to her could be the death of her. His name was Thomas Seymour. Henry VIII was scarcely cold in his tomb when the Dowager Queen married again. Within months of the old king's death in January 1547, Catherine Parr, the sixth wife, the one who had outlived him, wed Thomas Seymour in secret, and the haste of it scandalized a court that had not yet finished its mourning. Seymour was the Lord Admiral, brother to Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who now governed England as Lord Protector in the name of the 9-year-old King Edward VI, and he was uncle to that boy king himself. He was, in short, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and one of the most dangerous, tall, handsome, loud, restless, and consumed by envy of his elder brother's supremacy. He had wanted a great marriage. Before he settled on the widowed queen, he had let it be known that he might seek the hand of one of the late king's daughters, the Lady Mary or the Lady Elizabeth herself, and the council had refused even to entertain it. So he turned back to Catherine Parr, whom he had courted years before, in the days before a king took her and married her before anyone could gainsay him. Into that household, in the spring of 1547, came Elizabeth, a girl of 13, clever beyond her years, and now living under the roof of a man who looked at a king's daughter and saw a ladder to the throne. The house was at Chelsea, on the river to the west of London, Catherine Parr's dower manor, a place of gardens and books and gentle reformed piety that ought to have been the safest possible harbour for a fatherless girl. What happened there instead is known to us not through rumour or romance, but through the cold machinery of a state investigation. Nearly everything the record preserves comes from the depositions taken 2 years later, in the winter of 1549, when the government arrested the members of Elizabeth's household and questioned them under the shadow of the Tower, her governess, Catherine Ashley, Cat Ashley, the woman who had raised her almost from infancy, and her cofferer, the officer who kept her accounts, Thomas Parry. These are the statements of frightened servants drawn out under pressure, and they must be weighed as such. But they are also the documented heart of the matter, and what they describe is not a courtship. It is the conduct of a grown man toward a girl placed in his care. By their account, Seymour made a habit of coming to Elizabeth's bedchamber early in the morning, before she was risen or dressed, wearing only his nightgown. He would pull back the bed curtains and bid her good morrow. He would make as though to come at her. He would strike her familiarly and romp with her while she shrank back into the bed or fled behind the hangings. On some mornings her maids were present. On some, Cat Ashley herself, who once told him to be gone for shame. There was an episode in the garden at Hanworth, another of the houses they moved between, in which the Dowager Queen held Elizabeth still, while Seymour, laughing, took a knife to the girl's black gown and cut it into 100 pieces. These are small facts, plainly told, because that is what the honesty of the thing requires. This was a powerful adult man intruding, again and again, upon a 14-year-old under his protection, and the danger it carried was not only to her person, but to her very survival. A breath of scandal attached to a king's bastard daughter, a girl already declared illegitimate, already half a suspect by the accident of her birth, was the kind of thing from which lives did not recover. Cat Ashley saw it and grew alarmed and challenged the admiral to his face. He did not stop. It was Catherine Parr who finally acted. In the early summer of 1548, by one account having come upon her husband with Elizabeth in his arms, she sent the girl away from the household to the care of Sir Anthony Denny and his wife at chess hunt. Whatever passed in the Dowager Queen's own heart, the effect of it was to shield the child by putting distance between her and the man. It was the last thing Catherine Parr would do for her. She was pregnant that summer, and in the late days of August she bore a daughter, and on the 5th of September 1548 she died of the childbed fever that carried off so many women of the age. She had been the nearest thing to a mother Elizabeth had known since Anne Boleyn went to the scaffold, the one stepmother who had shown her a steady, uncomplicated warmth, and now she too was gone. The girl, not yet 15, was left adrift, her household scattering, her protectress buried, and the man at the center of the scandal now a widower, unattached, and more dangerous than he had ever been. For, with his wife dead, Thomas Seymour's ambition threw off its last restraint. He plotted against his own brother, the Protector. He tried to work his way into the control of the boy king, courting Edward in secret with gifts of pocket money the council would not give him. He gathered men and hoarded money and traded on his command of the fleet. And he spoke, to those he thought he could trust, of marrying the Lady Elizabeth, a step that pointed like a drawn arrow straight at the crown. For a subject to marry a princess in the line of succession without the council's consent was in itself close to treason. His recklessness finally destroyed him. In January 1549 he was caught at night within the king's private apartments at Hampton Court, where he had no business to be. A dog barked at the intruder, and he shot it, and the noise brought the guard. Within days the Lord Admiral was under arrest and lodged in the Tower of London, the same fortress that had already swallowed Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and so many others besides. And the machinery of the state now swung round, as it had swung on them, to face the household of the king's sister. Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry were seized and carried to the Tower to be interrogated. Ugly rumors ran through the court and out across the country that the Lady Elizabeth had been debauched by the Admiral, that she was carrying his child, a slander crafted to ruin her whether or not a shred of it could be proved, for a princess so shamed could be quietly struck from the succession and forgotten. At Hatfield, where the 15-year-old was kept, there arrived a hard and practiced counsellor named Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, sent for the express purpose of breaking her, of frightening her into confessing that she had agreed, behind the council's back, to marry Seymour. He tried every art he possessed. He told her that her servants had already confessed. He pressed her with what he claimed to know. He watched her face for any crack in it. He found none. Elizabeth admitted nothing that could damn her. She defended her honor and denied any plot. She kept her account exactly aligned with what Ashley and Parry had said, so that no gap could be levered open between them. And when the government let the pregnancy slander run, she did not shrink from it, but rounded on it, writing to the Protector to demand that a proclamation be published denying the rumor and punishing those who spread it, throwing her accusers onto the defensive and daring them to insult a princess of the blood on the strength of nothing but gossip. Tyrwhitt was reduced to frustration. He believed he could see guilt written in her face, and he could not wring a word of proof from her. He wrote to the Protector that she had a good wit, and nothing is gotten of her but by great policy, eats that she would confess to nothing, and that he was certain she and her servants had agreed upon their story before ever he arrived to shake it. He was right, and it did him no good. The interrogation yielded no confession, and Elizabeth walked clear of the affair with her honor and her place intact. Thomas Seymour was not so fortunate, though his ruin owed nothing to her. He was condemned without a trial, by an act of attainder driven through Parliament, his own brother the Protector setting his hand to the death of him, and on the 20th of March, 1549, he was beheaded on Tower Hill. There is a famous story that Elizabeth, on being told of it, remarked that here had died a man of much wit and very little judgment. It is a line that has trailed after her down the centuries, and it may catch something true about the man, but it appears in no contemporary record, and it should be named for exactly what it is, a later tradition, not a thing she is known to have said. The truth of what the episode left behind in her needs no invented epigram. She was 15 years old, and she had been schooled in the harshest classroom there is, in what nearness to power could cost, that a household could turn into a trap, that the people who loved her could be dragged to the Tower on her account, that a careless word or a misplaced trust could be spun into a rope. She had looked all of it in the eye and surrendered nothing, and she had lived. It was the first time she practiced the discipline that would come to define her whole existence. It would not be the last. She was 15 years old, and she had passed her first deadly test. She had looked a royal interrogation in the eye and given it nothing, and she had lived while the man at the center of the scandal died. But the lesson had cost her. She had learned that affection could be a snare, that the people nearest to her could be dragged to the Tower on her account, and that the only safety in this world lay in a locked and silent heart. It was a lesson she would never unlearn, and she would need it sooner than she knew. For the sickly boy on the throne, her brother Edward, would not live to grow up. When he died, the crown of England would pass, after a brief and bloody convulsion, to the one person alive with the most reason to fear and distrust, the bastard daughter of Anne Boleyn, her half-sister Mary, a devout, embittered Catholic queen who would come to see Elizabeth not as her heir, but as her rival, her enemy, and at last her prisoner in the Tower. The death of her half-brother brought the kingdom to the edge of the abyss. Edward VI died in July 1553, aged 15, a frail and bookish boy who had been ruled his whole short reign by ambitious men, and as he faded, those men made a desperate, doomed gamble. To keep the crown out of the hands of his elder half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic who would surely undo the Protestant revolution their father had begun, the Duke of Northumberland pushed forward his own daughter-in-law, the young Lady Jane Grey, and proclaimed her queen. For 9 days she wore a crown that was never hers. The country would not have it. The people rallied to Mary Tudor as the rightful heir of the House of Tudor. The coup collapsed almost before it had begun, and Mary rode into London in triumph with Elizabeth at her side. For one bright, deceptive moment, the two surviving daughters of Henry VIII were allies, riding together through the cheering streets, the Catholic and the Protestant. It was a unity that would not outlast the year. The alliance was a phantom, and the realities of the new reign dissolved it within months. Mary was a woman of rigid and suffering conviction, determined to lead England back to Rome and to the obedience of the Pope her father had defied. Elizabeth was the living emblem of everything Mary meant to undo. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Mary's own mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been cast aside and humiliated, the marriage that had broken England from the Church, and to devout Catholics that made Elizabeth not merely a heretic but the very symbol of the heresy, a bastard with no right to stand so near the throne. Mary distrusted her sister's religion, her youth, her dangerous popularity, and her blood itself. Elizabeth answered the danger the only way she knew, with an exquisite, exhausting performance of conformity. She went to Mass, she knelt, she professed a careful, measured piety that satisfied no one and convinced no one on either side. It was the same discipline she had learned in the wreck of the Seymour household, that the safest place to stand was behind a mask of total, unblinking obedience. The crisis came in the winter of 1554, when Mary announced that she would marry Philip of Spain. To the English, the prospect of a foreign Catholic king, a Habsburg who might drag their island into the wars and the religious machinery of the greatest empire on earth, was a nightmare, and it lit a fuse. In Kent, a gentleman named Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger raised the standard of rebellion against the Spanish match. His was only one arm of a wider design that had aimed, in part, to depose Mary, marry Elizabeth to a suitable English claimant, and set the pair of them on the throne. And that design, whether or not Elizabeth ever knew a word of it, made her its inevitable beneficiary and its obvious figurehead. Wyatt marched on London and was beaten in the streets, and the paranoia that followed his defeat was absolute. In the crackdown, the government reached even for those it had already spared. The Lady Jane Grey, harmless and imprisoned since her 9 days' reign, was sent to the block in February 1554 because her father had joined the rising, a reminder of how short the distance was between a royal claim and an axe. The council turned its eyes on Elizabeth. She was summoned from Hatfield to court. She was genuinely ill and had to be carried much of the way, pale and swollen and slow, but her sickness was nothing beside the fragility of her legal position. She was accused of complicity in the treason, and though no active part in it was ever proven against her, not then and not in the centuries since, she was precisely the person any plot against Mary would have sought to raise. Her road to the Tower was not a simple arrest. It was a duel fought in ink. When the council sent to move her downriver, she asked leave to write to the Queen, and she wrote with deliberate, unhurried care. She begged for a personal audience before she could be condemned unheard. She filled the page with her appeal, and when she came to the foot of it, with space still blank below her words, she scored that empty space through with heavy diagonal lines so that no hostile hand could add a forged sentence beneath her signature. By the time the ink was dry and the letter sealed, the tide on the Thames had turned, and the barge could not shoot the bridge against the current. She had bought herself a single day of life. It did not save her from the Tower. The letter, which survives to this day as the Tide letter, changed nothing but the date, yet it stands as a small, cold act of courage and cunning by a frightened girl of 20. When she was finally taken, on Palm Sunday, the 18th of March, 1554, she was rowed down the river to the fortress and delivered through its water gate. It is here that legend begins to bleed into history. Tradition, recorded in the later martyrologies of the Protestant cause, above all in the writings of John Foxe, paints a vivid picture of the princess sitting down upon the wet, cold stone in the rain, refusing to go in, protesting to the indifferent walls that she was as true a subject as any the queen had. It is a set piece of the legend, written up long afterward to cast the future queen as a suffering heroine, and it cannot be taken as a neutral record. What is beyond doubt is the terror and its rational cause. She was being carried into the very enclosure where her mother had waited for the sword 18 years before, where 2 of her stepmothers had died, and she had every reason on earth to believe she would leave it only for the scaffold. For some 2 months, she was held in the Queen's lodgings under heavy guard and pressed with relentless interrogation, and she gave her questioners nothing they could use. She had committed no provable crime and left no footprint. Wyatt himself, standing on the scaffold to face his own death, publicly cleared her of any share in his rising. The council was divided. The Queen's Chancellor, Bishop Stephen Gardiner, and the Spanish ambassador Simon Renard argued forcefully that the princess was a viper who must be killed for the safety of the realm. But there was no evidence with which to try her, and to execute a popular heir to the throne without proof was a risk from which even her enemies drew back. There was a colder calculation at work too. Philip of Spain, arriving to be Mary's husband, quietly counseled that Elizabeth be spared, reasoning that if she died, the next heir would be Mary, Queen of Scots, betrothed to the heir of France, so that the very champion of Catholic Europe found it served his interests to keep the Protestant Elizabeth alive. On the 19th of May 1554, a date that carried a grim, deliberate irony, being the 18th anniversary of the morning her mother was beheaded, Elizabeth was released from the Tower. It was not freedom, but a gentler captivity, a guarded exile at the old royal manor of Woodstock, deep in the Oxfordshire countryside, under the watch of Sir Henry Bedingfield. Her movements were restricted, her letters read, her household kept small. Tradition holds that during this confinement she scratched a short, defiant verse into a window pane with a diamond. "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be," quoth Elizabeth prisoner. And whether her own hand truly cut the words into the glass or a later age put them there to catch the spirit of her endurance, the sentiment fitted her exactly. She waited, she watched. Beyond the walls of Woodstock, England was beginning to burn as her sister's government sent Protestants to the fire by the hundred, and Elizabeth, the Protestants' great hope, held her tongue, went to Mass, and gave the regime no handle by which to seize her. She was learning that to survive the violent tides of the English crown, one had to become entirely, surgically detached from the impulses of the heart. The years of exile were the last hardening of her character. As the reign wore on, the tide began, slowly and without drama, to turn back toward the prisoner. Mary's health failed. Her longed-for pregnancies proved to be phantoms, swellings and hopes that came to nothing and left her broken. The child that would have secured a Catholic succession was never born, and the eyes of the court and of Europe drifted from the dying queen toward the young woman waiting at Hatfield. When the end came, on the 17th of November 1558, Mary Tudor died childless at St. James's Palace, and the crown for which men had schemed and killed passed, by the plain working of the law, to the bastard daughter of Anne Boleyn. The story is told that the news reached Elizabeth as she sat beneath an oak tree in the park at Hatfield, and that she answered it in the words of the psalm, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes," though the scene, like so much that would gather around her, carries the polish of later telling. What is certain is the fact beneath the legend. The girl who had been declared a bastard, hunted as a suspect, and shut in the Tower had outlasted every enemy and was queen. On the 17th of November 1558, the bells of London began to ring, and the woman who had been a bastard, a suspect, and a prisoner, who had twice stood within arm's reach of the block, was suddenly the most powerful person in England. She was 25 years old, and she had survived everything her enemies could throw at her by becoming unreadable, watchful, secretive, and utterly self-controlled, giving nothing of herself away. But survival was one thing, and rule was another. For a woman on the throne of England in 1558 was regarded by half of Europe as a thing against nature, a heretic, a bastard, a usurper with no right to reign at all, and by many of her own subjects as a stopgap who would surely marry within the year and hand the real power to a husband. If she was to hold the crown she had so narrowly lived to wear, it would not be enough to be clever, or careful, or lucky. She would have to become something the world had never seen, not merely a queen, but a goddess. And from her very first day on the throne, quietly and deliberately, the machine that would build the legend of Gloriana began its work. She had climbed out of the shadow of the axe and into the light of the throne, but the kingdom that came with it was in pieces. The treasury was empty, drained, and indebted by years of war. The coinage had been so debased that English money was distrusted across Europe. Only months before, in the January of 1558, England had lost Calais, the last of its possessions on the soil of France, held for more than 2 centuries, a wound to national pride so deep that Mary herself was said to feel it like a scar. The country was exhausted by a decade of religious upheaval that had lurched from her father's break with Rome to her brother's stern Protestantism to her sister's Catholic restoration and its burnings. 3 violent reversals in 11 years, leaving a bewildered people and a church at war with itself. Militarily, England was feeble, wedged between the 2 Catholic superpowers of France and Spain, either of which could put into the field armies and fleets that dwarfed her own. And, to the eyes of Catholic Europe, the young woman now wearing the crown was no queen at all but a blunder of history, a woman, unmarried and in the judgment of Rome and of the great Catholic monarchs who studied London from Madrid and Paris, the illegitimate child of an unlawful marriage, a bastard with no better title than an act of her father's parliament. The remedy, in the mind of every councillor and every foreign court, was obvious and urgent. She must marry, and marry soon. A husband would supply what the age believed a woman could not: the soldier's authority to defend the realm, the diplomatic weight of a royal alliance, the masculine command that 16th century thought held to be the natural order of the world. Her first parliament pressed it upon her within weeks of her accession, yet from the very first she set a different course, and the whole shape of her reign and the whole engine of the legend to come lay coiled in that refusal. She would not be a consort to a foreign prince, nor a puppet raised up by one faction of her own nobility. She would be the sole and singular authority, the fountain of all power, a monarch who answered to no living person but only to God. It was an extraordinary ambition for anyone in that world, and doubly so for a woman half of Christendom held to be base-born, and to make it real she would need far more than law and far more than armies, neither of which she possessed in any strength. She would need to build a kind of authority that no one could touch. On the 14th of January 1559, she rode in a great procession through the city of London toward Westminster, and the city met her with a sequence of elaborate staged pageants, tableaux of the virtues, of a flourishing commonwealth, of a new queen come to restore and to judge her people, a piece of public theatre, half welcome and half instruction, in which the reign began to explain itself to the crowd. The next day, the 15th of January, she was crowned in Westminster Abbey. Tradition holds that the very date had been chosen for her by the astrologer and philosopher John Dee, calculated for a favorable conjunction of the heavens, and though the story is no more than a tradition, it speaks to the hunger of the age for signs and fresh beginnings. The coronation itself was a delicate act of balance, performed by a junior bishop because the senior Catholic clergy would not set the crown upon a Protestant head, and stage managed to give no plain answer to the enormous religious question hanging over everything. Even so, the watchful could read a signal or two. She is reported to have withdrawn rather than see the host elevated in the old Catholic manner, a small and studied gesture that hinted which way the rein would lean without binding her to a single spoken word. The full answer would come not from the stars, but from the cold and deliberate construction of a new settlement of the Church. The religious settlement of 1559 was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity, and in it her method for the whole reign stood revealed. Through the act of supremacy, she made herself Supreme Governor of the Church of England, not Supreme Head, the title her father had seized, but a subtler style that asserted her command while yielding a little ground to those who balked at a woman set over the Church of God. Through the act of uniformity, she imposed a single book of common prayer, Protestant in its foundations but phrased with deliberate care, its words at the communion table drawn together out of earlier and more traditional forms so that a worshipper might read into them very nearly what he chose. The settlement was driven through a reluctant parliament against the massed resistance of Mary's surviving bishops, and it was designed, above all, to be broad, a church wide enough to hold as many of her subjects as could be brought to stand inside it. She is reported to have said, in a phrase set down long afterward by Francis Bacon, that she would not open windows into men's souls, that she had no wish to interrogate the private beliefs of her people, only to secure their outward obedience. Whether or not the words were exactly hers, they catch the pragmatism at the core of her. She did not seek a nation of fervent believers, but a nation of quiet subjects, and she was content to leave the conscience alone so long as the public peace was kept. She had survived by being unreadable, and she meant to rule by the same discipline. To the heart of her government, she drew the one man who would matter most across the whole length of her reign, William Cecil, whom she made her principal secretary on her very first day as queen. Cautious, tireless, methodical, and famously incorruptible, Cecil would serve her for 40 years as secretary and later, ennobled as Lord Burghley, as her Lord Treasurer, the indispensable architect of her state, so closely bound to her that the two of them came to work almost as a single instrument. Around him she gathered a small and brilliant circle of servants who ran the machinery beneath her hand. And over all of it she practiced an art of government entirely her own. Delay raised almost into a principle, calculated ambiguity, the playing of counselors and factions and foreign suitors one against another, and above everything an unbroken secrecy. Her personal motto caught it exactly: video et taceo, I see and keep silent. She would watch everything, commit to nothing until she must, and keep every decision that mattered locked within herself. And it was here, in the gap between her weakness and her ambition, that the golden legend of Gloriana was born. Elizabeth and her counselors grasped something few rulers of the age understood so clearly, that because she could not command by the ordinary props of kingship, no husband, no army worth the name, no undisputed title, she would have to command the imagination instead. So they set about building an image, and they built it with genius and with unresting patience for 40 years. They made of her an icon, the Virgin Queen, wedded not to any man but to her whole people, and reaching back past Christianity into the classical past, they arrayed her as the goddesses, Astrea, the Virgin of Justice, whose return would herald a golden age, Cynthia and Diana, the chaste and silver moon. Her likeness itself was brought under control. As early as 1563, the government drafted a proclamation to forbid unauthorized and unflattering images of the Queen and to fix a single approved pattern for her face, from which lesser painters were to copy and never to depart. Her accession day, the 17th of November, was raised over the years into an annual festival of the whole realm. The great tilts at which her courtiers jousted in her honor before vast and cheering crowds, a secular holyday deliberately cultivated to fill the space left by the abolished feasts of the Catholic calendar, turning the devotion of a nation away from the old saints and toward the living person of the Queen. And here the seam must be named plainly, for it is the spine of the entire story. The shining legend of Gloriana was not the grateful verdict of history. It was a work of political art, deliberate and sustained, begun in her own lifetime and largely at her own direction, the most successful image any English ruler has ever made. It was a magnificent construction, and it succeeded beyond all expectation, handing a small and frightened and divided nation a mirror in which it could see itself as a chosen and golden people, guarded by a monarch who seemed more than merely human. But behind the gathering gold, the woman was already more complicated and more human than the icon her servants were raising over her. She was 25 years old, and after a lifetime of watchfulness and captivity, she found herself suddenly free and powerful, and surrounded by the giddy liberty of a throne. And in the very years when her poets and her painters were writing her into the heavens as a cold and untouched star, the flesh and blood woman at the center of the design was about to imperil the whole of it, not through any enemy's plot or any foreign army, but through her own unguarded heart. The image the machine was building was of a woman untouchable and alone, wedded only to England, belonging to all her people and to no single man, a virgin queen as remote and radiant as a star. It was a magnificent fiction, and in the very years it was first being built, Elizabeth was giving the whole of Europe reason to laugh at it, because she had fallen, openly and without shame, for a married man, and she did not trouble to hide it. His name was Robert Dudley, and the court watched, scandalized, as the queen who was to be the untouched bride of her kingdom made no secret at all of loving him, riding with him, dancing with him, closeted with him day and night, showering him with gifts and titles. There was only one thing standing between Robert Dudley and the crown he so plainly wanted: a wife living quietly in the countryside, far from court and far from the queen. And then, on a September afternoon in 1560, that inconvenient wife was found dead at the foot of a staircase, her neck broken, in a house from which all the servants had been sent away. Robert Dudley was born to the high and deadly gamble of Tudor politics, and it ran in his blood on both sides of the scaffold. His grandfather, Edmund Dudley, had been a hated financial agent of Henry VII and was beheaded at the very start of the next reign in 1510, offered up by the young Henry VIII to appease a public that loathed his exactions. His father, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had risen to govern all England in the last years of the boy King Edward, and had then staked everything on the doomed attempt to set Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and lost his head for it in 1553. Robert himself had been swept up in that treason and shut in the Tower of London, tried and condemned, at the very time Elizabeth was held prisoner within the same walls under her sister's suspicion. His brother Guildford went to the block beside Jane Grey. Robert was spared, released, and slowly worked his way back to favor, redeeming himself in the field at the Battle of Saint-Quentin. He and Elizabeth were of an age, they had known each other as children, and they had both stared at the axe and lived. That shared passage through the shadow of death was one of the deepest bonds between them. When Elizabeth became queen, she made him her master of the horse, an office of constant daily physical closeness, for it set him at her side in the saddle, in the hunt, on every progress and procession, and before long she gave him the garter besides. He was everything the grim, cloistered years had lacked: tall, athletic, darkly handsome, a superb horseman, charged with a physical grace that drew every eye in the room. Within months, the court was watching a change in the queen that cut clean against the icon her servants were beginning to raise over her. Foreign ambassadors, whose whole trade was to report each flicker of the English court to their masters abroad, sent home dispatches of blunt and mounting alarm. The queen spent her days in Dudley's company, she visited his chambers, she laughed and whispered with him in a way that left no room for the decorum owed a throne. She meant, they were certain, to marry him. It was never merely a matter of the heart, and every man at court knew it. The queen's marriage was the single greatest question of the reign, and she appeared to be answering it in the most dangerous way conceivable, not with a prince who would bring England an ally, but with a subject whose family was stained 3 times over with the blood of the scaffold, and who, worst of all, already had a wife. Her name was Amy Robsart. She was the daughter of a Norfolk gentleman, and Dudley had married her in the summer of 1550, in a match the young King Edward thought notable enough to note in his own journal, a wedding that may well have begun in real affection. But affection had had 10 years to cool, and by 1559 the shape of their 2 lives had pulled entirely apart. Robert lived at the center of power, at the Queen's side from morning to midnight, while Amy kept to the countryside, moving among the houses of friends and servants, far from the glittering and perilous world her husband now inhabited. Her existence was an open sore on the reputation of a queen already beginning to style herself the Virgin Bride of England. For Elizabeth to be seen day upon day infatuated with a married man was to invite exactly the scandal that could rot the foundations of her legitimacy, and the whispers duly came. Envoys wrote to their sovereigns that the Queen would marry Dudley the very hour his wife was dead. Some reported that Amy was ailing, or that her death was being awaited with an impatience that looked like hunger. A few carried darker gossip still, that she might be helped to her end. The Spanish ambassador even relayed a warning he said had come from William Cecil himself, then alarmed and out of favor that Dudley and the Queen intended marriage, that Dudley thought to make away with his wife, and that they were putting it about she was ill when she was not. These were the reports of a court that lived and breathed on rumor, and they prove nothing whatever about what was true. But they are the measure of how poisonous the situation had already grown before anything at all had happened. And then something happened. On the 8th of September 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at Cumnor Place, a former monastic house near Oxford where she was then living, at the foot of a short flight of stairs, her neck broken. The circumstances were and remain profoundly strange. That very day, a Sunday, she had insisted that her whole household go out to a fair at Abingdon, pressing them to leave even when some were reluctant, so that she was alone in the house at the hour she died. The news broke over England and across Europe like a thunderclap. Dudley was with the Queen at Windsor when it reached him, and the letters he dashed off in the days that followed show a man gripped less by grief than by dread of what the world would make of it. He sent his kinsman Thomas Blount hurrying to Cumnor to uncover the truth, and pressed for the fullest possible inquiry, understanding that only a clear verdict could save his name. A coroner's inquest was convened, a jury empaneled, and after examining the body and the place where she lay, they returned their finding: misadventure, death by an accidental fall. But history has never rested easy with that verdict, and the honest reason is that the truth could not be established then and cannot be established now. Weigh the possibilities and refuse, as the evidence itself compels us to refuse, to choose among them. It may have been an accident, a fall on a steep stair, perhaps made deadly by sickness, for one explanation long canvassed by historians holds that Amy suffered from a malady such as a cancer of the breast, which can eat into the bones until an ordinary stumble, or even the strain of descending a staircase is enough to break a fragile neck. It may have been suicide, the act of an unhappy, isolated, perhaps gravely ill woman, humiliated before the whole of Europe by her husband's open devotion to another. Or it may have been murder, and here even the field of suspects resists a simple answer. Suspicion fell first and hardest upon Dudley, and it has never wholly left him, yet the timing was catastrophic for him, destroying at a single stroke the very marriage he was supposed to be clearing the way toward, which is the strongest of all the arguments that he had no hand in it. Others have wondered whether the true author, if there was one, might have been an enemy of Dudley's, someone who grasped that a dead wife in suspicious circumstances would poison his ambitions far more surely than a living one ever could. When the coroner's report was rediscovered in our own century, it was found to record head wounds as well as the broken neck, a detail that has deepened the mystery rather than dispelled it, as consistent with a headlong fall down a stone staircase as with anything darker. The plain and final truth is the one this story must give. We do not know whether Amy Robsart fell or jumped or was pushed, and we never will. What can be said with certainty is what her death did, and it was the exact opposite of what Dudley had hoped. Far from clearing his path to the Queen, it walled it off forever. To marry him now in the reeking aftermath of such a scandal would have been for Elizabeth to confirm the ugliest suspicion in Europe with her own hand, to appear before all the world as a woman who had waited for an inconvenient wife to die that she might take the husband. She saw the trap with the clarity that had kept her alive since childhood, and she drew back from it. She did not marry him. She could not. The death that should, by the crude arithmetic of the whispers, have opened the way to the throne, had slammed it shut instead, and the suspicion of it clung to them both, unproven and unshakable, for the rest of their lives. It was the hinge on which her whole private life turned. After the autumn of 1560, Elizabeth never again came so close to marrying for love, and there is good reason to think she never again fully meant to marry at all. Yet she could not let him go. She kept him near, heaped honours and lands upon him, and in 1564 created him Earl of Leicester. When she was struck down by smallpox in 1562 and her life was despaired of, she begged her council to make him Lord Protector of the realm should she die, and swore to them, even in that extremity, that though she loved him dearly, nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. It was as much a defense of her own reputation as a plea for his advancement, a last attempt to guard the image of the Queen even as she stared into the dark. She survived. The scars the disease left on her face she would spend the rest of her life burying beneath paint, but the deeper mark was on the shape of her life itself. She had learned that to be the Queen she had to be more than a woman, and that a dead woman at the foot of a staircase would stand between her and the man she loved for as long as they both should live. She would keep Dudley near her for the rest of his life. She would ennoble him, enrich him, and grieve him when he died, but she would never marry him. And the death of Amy Robsart left a far larger question hanging over the throne, a question that would consume the diplomacy of Europe for the next 30 years, and that has never been fully answered from that day to this. If not Dudley, then who? Kings and archdukes and princes would line up to court her. Her own councillors would beg her on their knees to marry and give England an heir. The fate of the kingdom would hang year after anxious year on her choice of a husband, and year after year, with a skill no other ruler of the age could match, Elizabeth would seem to consider and seem to yield and give absolutely nothing away. The most powerful woman in the world was becoming the most sought-after bride in it, and the secret she guarded behind all the courtships and all the coy delays was whether she had ever, after Amy Robsart, truly meant to marry at all. For the better part of her reign, the hand of the Queen of England was the single greatest prize in the diplomacy of Europe, and Elizabeth wielded it as her sharpest weapon. The suitors came and went for a quarter of a century. In the very first year of her reign, Philip of Spain himself, her late sister's widower and the most powerful monarch in the world, offered to marry her, hoping to hold England within the Catholic and Habsburg orbit. She thanked him graciously and delayed and let the offer quietly lapse. Eric of Sweden courted her ardently from afar, showering her with letters and gifts and envoys. The Archduke Charles of Austria was pursued through years of on-and-off negotiation until the matter foundered, as so many of them did, upon the rock of religion. And then, most seriously and most strangely of all, came the French princes of the House of Valois. First Henri, Duke of Anjou, and then, when Elizabeth was already in her 40s, his younger brother François, Duke of Alençon, and later himself Duke of Anjou, whom she courted through the late 1570s and into the 1580s. He was the only one of all her suitors ever to cross the sea and press his suit in person, coming to England twice to woo her in the flesh while the whole court looked on. She nicknamed him her frog, she gave him jewels, and on one famous day, before the French ambassador, she went so far as to declare aloud that she would marry him, and then within hours unsaid it. The match was loathed by much of her Protestant kingdom, and when a pamphleteer named John Stubbs published a tract denouncing it, the Queen had his right hand struck off for the insolence, a flash of the ruthlessness the golden legend prefers to forget. Through all of it, she flirted, corresponded, exchanged portraits, and let her counselors believe that a wedding was forever just one more concession away. It was a masterpiece of delay. She used the endless negotiations to hold France and Spain in balance, to buy her fragile kingdom time and safety, to wring out advantage, and she carried not one of them to the altar. Why she never married has been debated since the day she took the crown, and the explanation the record supports above all others is the plainest one: power. In the world Elizabeth inhabited, for a woman to marry was to submit. Law and custom were united and unbending on the point. A husband was his wife's head and master, entitled to her property, her body, and her obedience. And a queen who took a husband risked handing him her kingdom along with her hand. A foreign prince would bring his own crown's quarrels and his own crown's wars. An English lord raised to the throne beside her would lift one faction of her nobility over all the rest and shatter the balance she labored to keep. And she had watched, at close and bitter range, exactly what a husband did to a reigning queen's independence. Her own sister Mary had married Philip of Spain, and the marriage had dragged England into a Spanish war, cost it Calais, and reduced the queen herself, in the eyes of many of her subjects, to an unhappy adjunct of her husband's empire. Elizabeth had no intention of becoming a consort in her own realm. To remain unmarried was to keep the whole engine of the state in her own two hands, undivided and unshared, and she guarded that power with a ferocity that governed every waking decision of her life. This is the explanation the evidence supports most strongly, and it needs no other to stand. There was a colder strategic logic in it besides. An unmarried and childless queen was, by a grim paradox, harder to be rid of than a married one. So long as she bore no child and named no successor, her death promised not an orderly handover of power, but a plunge into chaos. And that very uncertainty was a kind of armor about her. To strike her down was to gamble the whole kingdom into the dark, and even her deadliest enemies had to reckon with what would follow. Her single state made her, for decades together, the most valuable piece on the board of European diplomacy, a bride to be dangled before one power in order to frighten another, a promise endlessly renewed and never once redeemed. Her refusal to marry was not merely evasion or timidity. It was an instrument of policy, and she played it with a patience and a nerve that no other ruler of the age could match. Historians have looked deeper as well into the shadows of her own history, and here the ground grows uncertain, and the honest course is to walk it with care. The dark places in her past are real and documented. Her mother was destroyed within a marriage, beheaded upon her father's order before the child was 3 years old. At 14, in the one household that ought to have sheltered her, a powerful man's attentions had come close to ruining her and had sent the servants she loved to the Tower, and the death of Amy Robsart had poisoned forever the single match she might truly have wanted. It is reasonable to wonder whether experiences such as these left in her a deep aversion to marriage or to the surrender of self that any marriage of the age would have demanded of her. But it must be named for exactly what it is. Speculation about an inner life the record does not lay open to us. Elizabeth did not write out her reasons, and no honest account can invent them for her. What can be known are her choices, made consistently and with iron resolve across 44 years on the throne. The private feeling beneath them is a door she kept shut in her own lifetime, and it is shut still. As for the whispers that ran through her lifetime and long after it, that she was somehow physically incapable of marriage or of bearing children, that some hidden defect of the body was the real reason for her refusal, they deserve to be named only so that they may be set firmly aside. There is no reliable evidence for any of them. They belong to the oldest and laziest habit in the telling of a powerful woman's life, the reflex to explain her away by her anatomy rather than her mind, to reduce a sovereign's cold and deliberate calculation to a flaw in her flesh. Elizabeth was a formidable head of state, making the most rational choice available to her in the circumstances she faced. That so many of her contemporaries preferred to imagine a broken body is a fact about them, and about their age, and not about her. And here Elizabeth and her regime performed their most extraordinary feat of political alchemy. They took what ought to have been read as her greatest weakness, a queen with no husband, no heir, and no named successor, and forged it into the very core of her power. She became the Virgin Queen, inviolate, entire in herself, belonging wholly and only to her people. It was an image that answered a deep and specific hunger. In a country that had lately pulled down the cult of the Virgin Mary, stripped its altars, and forbidden the old devotions, there was an emptiness where for centuries a sacred woman had stood, and into that emptiness the regime lifted Elizabeth, a new and secular virgin for a Protestant nation to venerate. Her own reply to Parliament in 1559, when the Commons first pressed her to take a husband, became the keynote of the entire 40-year performance. She was already bound unto a husband, she told them, which is the kingdom of England, and she held up her coronation ring as the very token of that marriage. Every Englishman and Englishwoman, she said, was her child. The words were genuine, and they were brilliant, and around them the poets and painters built all the rest. Astrea, the virgin of the returning golden age, Cynthia and Diana of the cold and chaste moon, the sieve portraits in which she holds the sieve of the Roman Vestal who proved her purity by carrying water without spilling a single drop. Name the scene one final time. The virginity was real enough as a political fact. But the cult raised upon it was a manufactured thing, an icon assembled as deliberately as any painting. The alchemy by which the very circumstance that should have left her exposed was made instead the thing that set her beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Yet the cost of this performance was immense. For 40 years the succession remained a vacuum, a gnawing, permanent anxiety for her advisers and a source of deep instability for the realm. She refused to name an heir, knowing that to do so would be to create a rival court and invite an early end to her own authority. She lived and ruled in a solitude that few have ever known, a woman surrounded by courtiers and ministers, yet entirely alone, with no partner, no equal, and no one to share the crushing weight of a crown. She had made her solitude into a throne, and her refusal into a kind of religion, the untouched Virgin Queen, wedded to her people, mistress of herself and of everything around her. But a queen alone was also a queen exposed. She had no husband to defend her, no child to succeed her, no named heir to make her murder pointless, and in 1570 the Pope in Rome formally declared her a heretic and a usurper, excommunicated her, and released all her Catholic subjects from their allegiance, telling them, in effect, that to depose or even to kill her would be no sin, but a holy duty. From that moment, every Catholic power in Europe, every exiled plotter, every zealot who believed her death would open the gates of heaven, turned their eyes toward England. Somewhere, always, a knife or a pistol or a phial of poison was being prepared for her, And to keep her alive, one man built something England had never possessed before, a web of watchers and informers and code breakers that stretched from the taverns of London to the courts of Rome, that opened letters and cracked ciphers and turned traitors inside out, and that would, in the end, drag its prey to the block. His name was Francis Walsingham, and he was the dark engine humming beneath the Golden Age. The golden legend of Gloriana obscures a fundamental and dangerous truth. Elizabeth's throne was never the serene, undisputed seat of a divinely favored sovereign. It was a contested position, perched upon a fault line that ran through the whole of Christendom, and more than once it came close to swallowing the kingdom whole. In February of 1570, the papacy made that danger explicit. Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, a document that transformed the political weather of the British Isles at a stroke. It excommunicated Elizabeth, branded her a heretic and a pretended queen, and, most corrosive of all, declared her subjects released from their allegiance, forbidding them to obey her on pain of sharing her condemnation. In the eyes of the most zealous of her enemies, the Queen of England was no longer a lawful ruler but a usurper whom any good Catholic might in conscience remove. This was not the paranoid imagining of a sheltered monarch. It was a cold, documented reality, and it hung over every year of the reign that followed. The plots that came were not whispers in the dark. They were strategic operations, often financed by the wealth of Spain or blessed by the authority of Rome, designed to dismantle the Elizabethan settlement through the violent removal of the head of state. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 was the first great alarm. It was a sprawling international conspiracy, devised by a Florentine banker, Roberto di Ridolfi, moving between London, Rome, and Madrid, that aimed to land a Spanish army on English soil, topple the Queen, and set her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, upon the throne with a Catholic husband at her side. The scheme reached into the highest rank of the English peerage, ensnaring Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, the premier nobleman of the realm and the only duke then living. His trial and execution in 1572 sent a brutal signal down through the aristocracy. The Queen's safety would be defended with the scaffold, and no blood was grand enough to be spared. Yet the pressure never lifted. The Throckmorton plot of 1583, another design to coordinate a foreign landing with a domestic Catholic rising, proved that the machinery of rebellion was only growing more practiced and more patient. Its author, Francis Throckmorton, went to the block in the summer of 1584. Behind each of these conspiracies stood the same shadow, the same Catholic claimant waiting in her English captivity, and often the same hand of Spain or of Rome. The fear that someone would one day kill the Queen was not a courtier's flattery or a minister's excuse. It was rational, it was constant, and it was very nearly fulfilled more than once. To meet that danger, the regime forged a weapon that would become the true dark engine of the Golden Age, the first modern professional intelligence service in English history. Its architect was Sir Francis Walsingham, who took the office of Principal Secretary in 1573 and held it with grim devotion until his death. Walsingham was an austere and deeply committed Protestant who saw the world as a single vast battlefield, and who believed without wavering that the survival of the English state and the survival of the Reformed faith were one and the same cause. He worked with a cold, tireless focus, assembling a network of agents, informers, and double agents that spanned the length of the kingdom and reached far beyond it, into the seminaries of the continent, the ports of France, the households of foreign ambassadors, and the very antechambers of Rome and Madrid. He paid for much of it out of his own purse, and he staffed it with men as comfortable with deception as with diplomacy, opening private letters, planting informers among the exiles, and turning captured couriers into unwilling instruments of the crown. At the heart of the machine sat Thomas Felipes, a cryptographer and forger of near supernatural ability. Felipes did not merely intercept correspondence, he broke the most intricate ciphers of the age, reading the secret hands of conspirators as easily as another man reads print. He commanded several languages, and when it served the state's purpose, he could counterfeit a seal or imitate a hand so exactly that his forgery would pass beneath the eyes of the very people who had written the original. Here, in the quiet traffic of opened letters and copied keys, the regime built something England had never before possessed, a system for knowing what its enemies believed to be secret. It was a surveillance state in its infancy, and it was one of the true and hidden foundations of the age we remember as golden. It was in the cold light of these intercepted letters and betrayed confidences, as much as beneath the jewels of any portrait, that the iron-willed Elizabeth truly resided. The machine demanded fuel, and it found it in the lives of ordinary English Catholics. As the threat of invasion and assassination grew, the state's tolerance for the old faith drained away, and the penal laws became the screws that tightened year upon year over an entire community. Recusancy, the refusal to attend the Protestant services now required by statute, had long carried a penalty. In 1581, the fine was raised to a crushing £20 a month, a sum great enough to strip a gentry family of its lands within a few years and grind lesser households into ruin. The same statute made it treason to draw a subject away from his obedience to the Church of England, and treason to be so drawn. 4 years later, the Act of 1585 went further still, declaring that any priest ordained abroad who simply set foot on English soil was, by that act alone, guilty of high treason. The regime had ceased merely to police belief. It had begun to criminalize the very existence of the Catholic priesthood and to hunt the men who embodied it through the hedgerows and manor houses of England with the relentless efficiency of Walsingham's web. Among those hunted men was Edmund Campion. He had been one of the most brilliant scholars of his generation, a luminary of Oxford so admired that the Queen herself had once marked him out for favor, and he had given all of it up. The preferment, the safety, the applause, to go abroad, take holy orders, and join the Society of Jesus. When he slipped back into England in 1580, he insisted that his errand was purely spiritual, to preach, to hear confession, and to minister to a persecuted people, not to meddle in the plots of princes. He put that claim in writing, in a printed challenge that passed from hand to hand and infuriated the authorities. Hunted the length of the country, he was run to ground at Lyford Grange in Berkshire in July 1581, dragged from a hidden chamber in the house, and carried to the Tower of London. There he was put to the rack, stretched upon the frame more than once to force from him the names of those who had sheltered him and a recantation of his faith. He surrendered almost nothing of either. The sight of a man of such learning broken upon the frame in the cold pursuit of state security is a necessary counterpoint to the portraits of the jewel-bedecked Queen. Tried on a charge of treason that many then and many since have judged to have been manufactured, he was taken to Tyburn on the 1st of December 1581, and there suffered the traitor's death the law prescribed. He was one of an estimated 130 or more Catholics, priests and laypeople alike, put to death across the long reign for refusing to bend. There is an aching contradiction at the center of all this, and the film's thesis lives inside it. Elizabeth is reported to have said that she had no wish to make windows into men's souls, that she cared for outward obedience and would not probe the private conscience. Yet the apparatus she authorized and Walsingham drove did precisely the opposite. It probed, it intercepted, it interrogated under torture, and it demanded a loyalty that the state had come to equate with the survival of the realm itself. Both things were true at once, and neither cancels the other. The regime faced genuine conspiracies and fought a real war for its sovereign's life, and to fight that war it built a machine of surveillance, coercion, and religious persecution that the golden legend quietly forgets. The Queen, who projected an image of maternal radiant serenity, presided over a state that broke bodies in the name of political necessity. These two truths cannot be separated. Her achievement in holding England independent and unconquered was real, and it rested in no small part upon the ruthlessness of the apparatus that kept her alive. Yet, for all the captured priests and the executed plotters, Walsingham's web was always intended for a larger, more elusive quarry. Every intercepted letter, every compromised cipher, and every broken conspirator eventually pointed towards the same focal point, the woman whose very presence on English soil acted as a constant, dangerous temptation to every malcontent in the kingdom. She was the Catholic claimant to the throne, the woman who possessed a rival bloodline and a rival faith, and whose existence made the dream of a Catholic England a permanent possibility. She was the magnet toward which all the iron filings of treason were drawn. For nearly 20 years she had been there, a second queen on English soil, uninvited, unwanted, and impossible to be rid of, a prisoner who was also the most dangerous woman in the kingdom. She had come to England fleeing the ruin of her own reign in Scotland, throwing herself on her cousin's mercy, and Elizabeth had done with her the only thing she could bring herself to do, neither free her, nor kill her, nor ever once agree to meet her, but simply keep her moved from castle to castle, watched, isolated, growing older and more bitter and more desperate with every passing year. And every plot against Elizabeth's life bent toward this captive queen like iron filings toward a magnet, because she was the alternative, the Catholic sovereign who would take the English throne the very hour Elizabeth fell. Two queens, cousins, mirror images of one another, each the other's shadow and the other's death, locked together in a single small kingdom that had room for only one of them. And in the shadows, Francis Walsingham was quietly, patiently weaving the trap that would at last force Elizabeth to do the one thing she dreaded above all others on this earth, to sign the death of a fellow anointed queen. For 19 years there were two queens in England, and only one of them wore a crown. The other lived under guard, moved from castle to castle across the English Midlands, and yet by her mere existence she bent the politics of a kingdom around herself. Elizabeth could not comfortably do any of the things that might have ended the matter. She could not set the woman free, nor keep her forever without cause, nor send her back to be destroyed by the men who had driven her from her own throne. Mary, Queen of Scots, had become, by the sheer gravity of her presence, a living question that refused to be answered, a shadow that stretched across the whole of Elizabeth's England. She was, in every sense, the mirror rival to the woman in London, and she is not to be confused with the other Mary, Elizabeth's late half-sister, the Catholic Mary Tudor, who had once held her prisoner in the Tower. This was a different Mary altogether, younger than Elizabeth, a reigning queen in her own right, a woman ruling in a man's world exactly as her cousin did, and her opposite in almost everything else. She was Catholic where Elizabeth was Protestant. She was governed by her heart where Elizabeth was governed by calculation. She was warm, impulsive, and open where Elizabeth was watchful and closed. And where Elizabeth was the supreme survivor of the age, Mary had proved catastrophically unlucky and unwise. Where Elizabeth was the careful architect of her own image, Mary was the embodiment of the older dynastic world, and she trusted it to save her long after it had turned against her. Her life had been a tragedy of high birth and poor fortune. She had been Queen of Scots before she was a week old, crowned in infancy on the death of her father. She had been sent to France as a small child and raised at its glittering court. And by her first marriage she had been, for a brief season, Queen Consort of France as well. Widowed young, she returned in 1561 to a Scotland she barely knew, a poor, cold, fiercely Protestant country in the grip of a religious revolution, ruled in all but name by lords who had no intention of being ruled by her. What followed was a swift and terrible unraveling. She watched her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, dragged from her supper table and stabbed to death almost in her presence while she was heavily pregnant. She endured the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, whose lodging on the edge of Edinburgh was destroyed by an explosion in the night. And then, in the act that finished her, she married the Earl of Bothwell, the man most widely believed to have arranged that murder. Her outraged lords rose against her, defeated her, and forced her to abdicate. Imprisoned on an island in a Scottish loch, she escaped, raised one last army, lost a final battle, and ran. In May 1568, she crossed the Solway Firth into England, a queen with nothing left but her rank, and threw herself upon Elizabeth's protection. She appears to have believed that one anointed queen would hold the life and dignity of another as something sacred. She could not have been more wrong about the country she had entered. For Elizabeth, the arrival of the Scottish queen was the single most dangerous development of the entire reign. Mary was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's elder sister, and by the ordinary rules of descent she stood next in blood to the English throne. But in Catholic eyes, she was far more than an heir. To the Catholic world, and by the laws of the Church, Elizabeth was a bastard and no true queen, which made Mary not the successor, but the rightful sovereign of England already, a crowned adult Catholic claimant, now sitting inside the very realm to which she had, in Catholic reckoning, the better title. The problem paralyzed the English government because every solution was a catastrophe. To send Mary home was to hand her to the Protestant lords who would kill her, and to make Elizabeth complicit in the judicial murder of a cousin and a queen. To set her at liberty in England was to loose upon the country a living figurehead around whom every rebellion, every invasion scheme, and every assassination plot would inevitably gather. And to receive her honorably at court as a sister sovereign was to acknowledge her rank and her nearness to the throne, and to plant a rival monarch at the very heart of the state. So Elizabeth chose the only course that decided nothing and postponed everything, the survivor's course as ever. She neither embraced Mary nor expelled her. She simply held her and went on holding her year after year after year. What followed was 19 years of a strange, suspended cruelty. Mary was lodged in a succession of castles and manor houses, Tutbury, Sheffield, Wingfield, Chatsworth, and others, mostly in the keeping of George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the few noblemen wealthy and trusted enough to bear the cost and the risk. It was not a dungeon. She kept a household of her own servants, her cloth of state, her small luxuries. She rode a little when her health allowed, and she sat for long hours over her needlework, stitching emblems heavy with hidden meaning in the company of the Earl's formidable wife, Bess of Hardwicke. But it was captivity all the same, and it ground on for the better part of 2 decades, wearing a once vibrant young queen down into an ailing, prematurely aged, endlessly scheming prisoner who never stopped hoping for rescue and never stopped conspiring toward it. Across the years, the 2 queens exchanged letters and gifts, tokens of embroidery, jewels, portraits, the formal courtesies of royalty, cousinly words that carried a current of mutual suspicion beneath them that no amount of written ink could bridge. They moved in the same orbit, bound together by blood and by the crown. In all that time, they never once met, face to face. For years, Elizabeth's own counselors pressed her, with a mounting and eventually desperate urgency, to end the danger in the only way they believed final, to bring the Scottish Queen to trial and put her to death. Walsingham and Burghley were foremost among them, and they had the logic of the situation on their side. For as long as Mary lived, she was the standing prize of every conspiracy, a constant bleeding wound in the side of the state, and for years Elizabeth refused. Her reasons were on the record, and they were neither softness nor sentiment. She was appalled at the precedent of executing an anointed queen, a fellow sovereign, a near kinswoman, and a crowned head like herself. To let a court of subjects sit in judgment upon a queen's life and take it was to strike at the sacred principle on which her own security rested. It was to teach the world that a monarch could be tried and killed by process of law, a lesson that might one day be recited back to her own head. To that horror was joined her deep and characteristic reluctance ever to take a step that could not afterward be undone. It was not weakness. It was the same iron caution that governed her whole reign, and it left the danger festering and her own life exposed for the better part of 20 years. And while Elizabeth held back, the law itself was being reshaped around her prisoner. After the discovery of yet another conspiracy against the Queen's life, her council drew up in 1584 the Bond of Association, a remarkable and chilling document by which thousands of Englishmen swore to hunt down and kill anyone who attempted Elizabeth's life, and pointedly anyone in whose name or for whose benefit such an attempt was made, whether or not that person had known of it. It was aimed unmistakably at Mary, and it amounted to a license for her killing. The following year, Parliament gave the principal statutory form in the Act for the Queen's safety, which established a lawful commission to try any claimant to the throne implicated in a plot against Elizabeth, and to bar them from the succession or send them to their death. The machinery to destroy the Scottish Queen now existed in law. All that was wanting was the evidence to feed into it. That evidence Walsingham resolved to manufacture by patience and by craft, since what Elizabeth would not resolve by open policy he understood he must engineer. So long as the Queen forbade it, an execution was impossible. He would therefore construct a situation in which she could not refuse. In 1585 he had Mary moved to Chartley in Staffordshire and placed in the keeping of Sir Amyas Paulet, a rigid Puritan who felt none of the awe of majesty that had softened her earlier guardians, and who answered in effect to Walsingham alone. Her comforts were narrowed, her contacts were cut. And then Walsingham did the subtler thing. Through a double agent named Gilbert Gifford, he opened a secret channel by which Mary's letters could be smuggled in and out of the house, concealed in the waterproof stopper of a beer barrel that passed regularly through the walls of her prison, a channel Mary believed to be entirely her own, a private lifeline to the outside world, and which in truth Walsingham owned from end to end. Every letter that entered or left ran first across his cryptographer's desks in London. Isolated, ailing, and desperate after nearly 2 decades behind stone walls, Mary took the bait. She believed at last that she had found a way to reach her friends unseen, and she began to write freely in the ciphers she trusted with her life. Every letter that Mary, Queen of Scots, smuggled out of her prison at Chartley, sealed, ciphered, and hidden with such care, carried in secret by men she trusted with her life, passed first across the desk of the one man in England who wanted her dead. She believed she was writing to her friends and her rescuers. She was writing to Francis Walsingham, and in the summer of 1586, into that poisoned channel came exactly the letter he had been waiting nearly 20 years to read, a message from a young, wealthy, and passionate Catholic named Anthony Babington, laying out in detail a plot to murder Elizabeth, free Mary from her captivity, and raise a Catholic rising with Spanish support, and asking the imprisoned Queen in so many words for her blessing upon it. Walsingham had his hook baited at last. All he needed now was for Mary to reply. And Mary, isolated, desperate after 18 years behind stone walls, and fatally certain that no one on earth could read her cipher, picked up her pen and answered. Into that poisoned channel of correspondence, Francis Walsingham poured the full weight of his cold administrative brilliance. For years he had been building a surveillance state that reached into every corner of the realm. Now, with the Scottish Queen's every secret word passing through his hands, he had at last caught his quarry in a trap of her own making. The design was the Babington plot, a scheme of the summer of 1586 that aimed at nothing less than the assassination of Elizabeth, the freeing of Mary, and a Catholic rising to be met by a Spanish invasion. Its figurehead was Anthony Babington, a young, wealthy, and ardent Catholic gentleman who as a boy had served as a page in the Scottish Queen's own captive household. When he wrote to her that July, setting out the whole design, the rising, the foreign aid, and the killing of the woman he called the usurper, he was, in effect, handing his life to a man who had already decrypted his intentions before Mary ever read them. Her reply, written in cipher and carried out of Chartley in the stopper of a beer barrel, was the document Walsingham had spent his career waiting for. In it she did not merely acknowledge the plot. She approved it and discussed the practical mechanics of her own rescue and of the uprising with a clarity that left the government no room for doubt. In the eyes of the English state, she had crossed the line from a captive foreign queen into a conspirator in the death of an anointed sovereign. Walsingham, however, was not a man content with the mere sufficiency of evidence. He was a man who believed in the perfection of the trap. His cryptographer, Thomas Philippes, added a final and chilling refinement. To the copy of Mary's letter that passed on to Babington, Philippes forged a postscript in Mary's own cipher, posing as the Queen to ask for the names of the 6 gentlemen who had undertaken the actual killing, a device designed to flush every last conspirator into the open. When he had first decoded Mary's fatal reply, Philippes is said to have drawn a small gallows upon the copy he sent to his master, a mordant private mark of what the letter now meant. Whether the forged postscript was strictly necessary to secure a conviction remains a subject of historical debate, but the willingness to manufacture it reveals the terrifying reach and the cold temper of the machine Elizabeth had fostered. The conspirators were rounded up, interrogated, and sent to the scaffold in the autumn of 1586. And the Scottish Queen was moved to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire to face a trial that would decide the fate of her life and the stability of the English crown. The trial, held in October 1586, was a grim affair of state. Mary was brought before a special commission of some 36 English peers, privy councillors, and judges, a prisoner in a foreign land, denied the assistance of counsel, denied sight of the documents being used to condemn her, and denied any witnesses in her defense. She met it with a regal defiance that unnerved her judges. She refused to the very last to concede that any earthly court possessed the jurisdiction to try an anointed queen, and she defended herself with a sharp and articulate intelligence across 2 days of proceedings. Yet the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The commissioners found her guilty of compassing and imagining the death of the Queen of England, and the report of that judgment was carried to London, where Parliament and Council now clamoured with one voice for her death, and where the machinery of the state began to grind toward the only resolution the Council would accept. For Elizabeth, the weeks that followed were an ordeal of hesitation, and the record of them was set down not by her imagination but by the men who watched her. She was trapped between the relentless certainty of her ministers, who insisted that the safety of the realm and of the reformed religion required Mary's death, and her own documented dread of the act itself. She had built her security upon the sacredness of crowned heads, and to order the judicial killing of a fellow queen was to endanger that very principle. a precedent that could one day be turned against her own head. By the accounts of those around her, she raged, she wept, she prayed, and above all she delayed, turning the warrant away and calling for it again, holding the whole court in an agony of suspense. She even attempted to sidestep the responsibility of a public execution altogether. She had it suggested to Mary's keepers, Sir Amyas Paulet and Sir Drew Drury, that under the oath of the bond of association they might quietly make away with their prisoner and spare the Queen the spectacle of a formal death. It was the measure of those two men that they refused her outright, flatly declining to become the private murderers of the woman in their charge. Elizabeth was left alone with the decision she could not bring herself to make, surrounded by counselors convinced that she was courting the ruin of the kingdom by her refusal to act. On the 1st of February, 1587, the pressure reached its breaking point. Elizabeth signed the death warrant at Richmond and handed it to her secretary, William Davison, and then, characteristically, she hedged even in the act of signing, speaking in circles about whether the warrant should be sped upon its way or held in reserve, carefully ensuring that the final, irrevocable step should never rest upon a single plain command of her own. Her ministers read her intentions as 30 years of service had taught them to read her. Led by the indefatigable William Cecil, Lord Burghley, the Privy Council met in secret, resolved to act upon the signed warrant without troubling the Queen again, and dispatched it north to Fotheringhay with an urgency calculated to leave no room for her to change her mind. When word came back to London a week later that the thing was done, Elizabeth's response was a storm of grief, indignation, and fury. She protested that her councillors had acted in direct defiance of her wishes, that they had usurped her authority and forced her hand. Whether that storm was a genuine collapse of her composure or a performance of innocence built for the courts of Europe, or, most likely, a corrosive mixture of both, the record cannot finally tell us, and the film will not pretend to see into her heart. But the political act beneath it was unmistakable and deliberate. She turned her wrath upon William Davison, the man who had been the mere instrument of the council's will, and had him arrested, thrown into the Tower, tried before the Star Chamber, and stripped of his office, his fortune, and his reputation. He was the scapegoat, the necessary sacrifice, who allowed the guilt of a queen's death to fall upon someone other than the Queen. As the historian John Guy has observed, Elizabeth had arranged the whole affair with such calculated ambiguity that the blame could be made to settle anywhere but upon herself. The execution itself, conducted on the 8th of February 1587, was the sombre close of the tragedy. In the Great Hall of Fotheringhay, Mary, Queen of Scots, met her death with a composure that disconcerted the men who had come to see it done. She entered dressed in black, but when her attendants removed the outer gown, she stood revealed in a bodice and petticoat of deep, vibrant crimson, the liturgical color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church, a last silent statement that she died for her faith and not for her treason. She forgave her executioner, as custom asked, knelt, and laid her head upon the block. The axe did not fall cleanly. More than one stroke was needed before its work was done, and the silence that followed in the hall was the silence of a world transformed. An anointed sovereign had been put to death by the warrant of another, a thing all but without precedent in the history of Christendom, and the shock of it ran through every royal house in Europe. Nor did the act end with the age that committed it. The same logic by which a queen could be tried and killed by her own subjects would return, 2 generations later, to bring Mary's own grandson to a public scaffold of his own. The shadow cast by the event was long and cold. Elizabeth spent the months that followed in what looked to those around her like genuine mourning, and she had made a broken man carry the guilt of the deed. Yet the strategic reality was unaltered, and in one respect it had darkened sharply. The killing of Mary had handed the Catholic powers of the continent the one thing they had always lacked, a clear, unanswerable pretext for a crusade against the heretic Queen of England. The moral and legal murk of the trial and the execution served only to harden the resolve of those who had always held Elizabeth a usurper and a tyrant. In the royal courts across the sea, the news was received not merely as a death, but as a challenge and a summons. The season of proxy wars and covert plots was ending. The time of open, direct confrontation had come. The head of an anointed queen had fallen on the boards of Fotheringhay, and across the sea the most powerful monarch on earth took it as his signal. Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth's own former brother-in-law, the sword and shield of the Catholic cause, master of an empire on which the sun never set, had endured her heresy, her pirates, and her meddling in his dominions for 30 long years. Now she had spilled the blood of a Catholic queen, and his patience was at an end. In the harbors of Spain and Portugal, a fleet began to gather such as the world had never seen. Some 130 ships, an armada they proclaimed invincible, sent to sweep the bastard heretic from her throne and drag England back, by fire and sword, to the arms of Rome. In the summer of 1588 it came up the Channel in a vast crescent of sail, and England, smaller, poorer, its Protestant queen a woman, the whole of Catholic Europe had been assured was no rightful ruler at all, stood almost alone in its path. What happened next would become the most famous story the legend of Gloriana ever told. And like the best of that legend, it would be only half true. The execution at Fotheringhay did not begin the war between England and Spain. It ended the long pretense that there was not already one. For 30 years, Philip II of Spain had absorbed provocation upon provocation from the Queen, who had once briefly been his sister-in-law. Her Protestant heresy, her sea captains preying upon his treasure fleets, her soldiers and her money slipped quietly to the rebels in his Dutch provinces, and for 30 years he had drawn back from the final step. The killing of a Catholic queen dissolved the last of his restraint and gave his enmity the shape of a holy cause. The cold, simmering hostility of a generation hardened, in that year, into an absolute resolve to conquer. The instrument of that resolve was the enterprise of England. Philip assembled a fleet of around 130 ships. The figure is an estimate, and worth treating as one, a vast floating fortress that was to sail up the English Channel, make its rendezvous off the Flemish coast with the battle-hardened army of the Duke of Parma waiting in the Netherlands, and ferry that veteran invasion force across the narrow sea to the shore of England. Command of the Armada fell, after the death of Spain's greatest admiral, to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a conscientious and capable grandee who had begged to be excused the office, protesting with unusual honesty that he knew little of the sea and was prone to sickness upon it, and who was overruled by his king. It was the gravest foreign threat England had faced in living memory, and the fear that gripped the country was not a matter of courtly posturing. It was the visceral, suffocating terror of a people who expected that summer to be invaded and overrun, and who had little in the way of a standing army to set against the finest infantry in Europe. The campaign, when it came, played out as a drama of desperation rather than a single glorious battle. When the Armada entered the Channel in late July, it moved in a majestic defensive crescent, a bristling wall of hulls that the English found almost impossible to break, for the Spanish design was to grapple and board where their soldiers could overwhelm any English crew, and the English captains, under the Lord Admiral Howard of Effingham and his Vice Admiral Francis Drake, refused to be baited into that close and murderous embrace. Instead, they harried the flanks from windward and at a distance, trading long-range gunfire for a week up the length of the Channel without landing a decisive blow. The decisive shift, when it came, was born not of a cannonade but of necessity. The Spanish had anchored in a tight mass off Calais to wait for word from Parma. On the black wind-whipped night of the 7th of August, the English packed 8 old vessels with pitch, brimstone and powder, set them ablaze, and turned them loose upon the tide toward the crowded Spanish anchorage. They drifted down like hellfire made manifest, and fireships were the one weapon every sailor of the age truly dreaded. The more so as a rumor ran that these might be crammed with exploding charges as well. Panic, irrational and absolute, tore through the Spanish lines. Rather than wait to be burned, ship after ship cut its anchor cables and ran for open water in the darkness, and the tight crescent that had held for a week came apart in a single night. When the sun rose, the crescent was broken and scattered, and in the running fight that followed off Gravelines, the lighter, faster, more heavily gunned English ships at last closed and punished the disordered fleet. But the true victor was neither Drake nor Howard nor the Queen. It was the weather and the collapse of the plan. Parma's army never came out to meet the fleet. The Duke could not embark his men, for the shallow Flemish harbors held no deep water port that the great ships could enter, and a squadron of Dutch flyboats lay off the coast to cut down any barge that dared put to sea. The rendezvous upon which the whole enterprise depended was impossible, and had perhaps always been so. Broken in formation and unable to beat back down the Channel against the gale, the surviving Spanish ships were driven to flee the only way left open to them, north around the top of Scotland and down the wild, jagged western coast of Ireland. There the autumn storms finished what the English guns had begun. Dozens of ships were smashed to kindling against the Atlantic rocks, thousands of men drowned in the surf or were slaughtered as they crawled ashore. Somewhere between a third and a half of the great fleet never saw Spain again, and of the tens of thousands who had sailed, an appalling number died, most of them not in battle at all, but of shipwreck, disease, and starvation on the long road home. To Protestant England, it was not a military victory, it was a miracle. A commemorative medal struck to mark the triumph captured the national mood in a single ringing motto: God blew with his winds, and they were scattered. In the immediate wake of the deliverance, the regime reached for the summit of its power. On the 9th of August, with the sea fight won but a land invasion by Parma still feared, Elizabeth rode down to the army mustered at Tilbury on the Thames below London and addressed the troops in a moment that has since become the cornerstone of her legend. The words history remembers are among the most famous ever spoken by an English monarch, that she knew she had the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. They are magnificent, and they may be close to what she said. But the historian is bound to state the truth plainly in the same breath. The received text survives in no contemporary record of that day. It comes from a letter written more than 30 years later in the 1620s by a man named Lionel Sharp, who claimed to have been present, and it was not printed until 1654. A different and earlier version, published in 1612 by another writer, gives a noticeably different account. So the most celebrated speech in English history is, in the form we all know, a reconstruction set down decades after the fact, a work of political art, quite possibly faithful in spirit, certainly polished in the retelling, and impossible now to verify as her own verbatim address. The film honors the resonance of the moment while flagging the seam. This was the heartbeat of the legend, and much of it was crafted long after the danger had safely passed. The propaganda machine then moved with extraordinary speed to crystallize the victory into a permanent icon. The Armada portrait, most likely the work of the painter George Gower, became the defining image of the reign. In it, Elizabeth rests her hand serenely upon a globe, her fingers spread across the Americas as though the new world lay beneath her palm. Behind one shoulder, the English fleet rides at anchor upon a calm sea, and behind the other, the Spanish ships are dashed to pieces against a rocky coast. It is not a record of the war. It is an argument, the visual embodiment of the Virgin Queen, shielded by God and her own defiance, standing as the eternal guarantor of English liberty. The messier reality was quietly folded away, that England had been saved at least as much by the weather, by the impossibility of Parma's crossing, and by the sheer logistical failure of an overreaching plan as by any particular brilliance of the Queen's strategy, and that the victory was as much an escape as a triumph. What hung upon the wall afterward was the shining version, a narrative of divine favor and royal glory, and it is the version the world has believed for 400 years. Yet behind that gleaming portrait lay a dark, unvarnished aftermath that the Golden Story carefully omits, and it is one of the truest and most shameful footnotes to the brightest page of the whole reign. After the bells had stopped ringing and the bonfires had burned out, the men who had actually beaten the Armada were treated with a callousness that shames the legend they had made possible. Typhus and dysentery, the silent killers of every crowded fleet of the age, swept through the ill-provisioned English ships as they lay in the Channel ports. Sailors who had survived the Spanish guns now began to die by the hundred, and then by the thousand in the streets and along the quays of the southern towns. They were sick, they were half-starved, and, most damning of all, they were unpaid. The Queen's government, forever anxious over the cost of the war, was slow and grudging in finding the wages owed to the men who had stood between the kingdom and its conquest. The Lord Admiral, Howard of Effingham, wrote to the council in genuine distress of men who had served so valiantly now dying so miserably for want of the coins that were due to them, and he was reduced to paying some of them out of his own pocket, a private mercy that only threw the public neglect into sharper relief. The Queen, whose new portrait proclaimed her the God-sent savior of her people, left many of the very men who had saved her to die, unwaged, in rags, within sight of the sea they had defended. The year 1588 was the summit, the moment the legend became unshakable, fixed forever in the imagination of a nation, the Virgin Queen and her Protestant wind against the whole might of Catholic Spain, the goddess with her hand upon the globe. Elizabeth was 54 years old, and to the eye of history she stands there still, gowned and jeweled and eternally triumphant, at the very height of her glory. But the woman inside that portrait was aging, and she knew it, and she was about to spend the last 15 years of her life waging a war that no one wins, not against Spain, but against time itself. The smallpox had scarred her face a quarter of a century before. Her teeth were going black in her head. Her hair was thinning and graying beneath the wigs. The famous features were slowly becoming a ruin that only paint could hide. And so the great machine that had built Gloriana turned to its last and strangest labor, to stop the clock by force, to paint out every year and every scar, and to hold up before a decaying old woman a shining, ageless mask, and to make the whole world look at the mask and call it the Queen. The triumph of 1588 was a moment frozen in time, a victory seized and turned into a permanent monument. Yet even as the bells rang out for the scattering of the Armada, the woman at the heart of the celebration was already moving toward a different kind of war, a slow, private, and unwinnable struggle against the erosion of her own body. The legend of Gloriana had been designed to be immortal. The monarch who wore the crown was flesh and blood, subject to the same decay that claimed the lowliest of her subjects. And to sustain the myth of a queen perpetually in her prime, the court of the later years became a theater of illusion in which the truth of the aging body was buried beneath layers of artifice. Nowhere does the distance between the woman and the image stand so nakedly exposed as here. At the end, the real, aging body of a woman in her 60s against the timeless, ageless icon the portraits insisted upon. That distance had opened with a single illness decades before. In the autumn of 1562, only 4 years into her reign, Elizabeth was struck down at Hampton Court by a virulent attack of smallpox, a disease that swept the Tudor court and carried off rich and poor without distinction. For a few days she lay speechless and burning, so close to death that her counselors met in alarm to argue over the succession, and the kingdom she had so narrowly begun to govern stood at the edge of chaos. She survived, but the disease left its signature on the one asset a queen in her position could least afford to lose. Her face, once famously fair, was scarred by the pox. And what the illness could do was written still more cruelly on the body of the woman who had nursed her, Lady Mary Sidney, who caught the smallpox at the Queen's bedside and was so badly disfigured by it that she withdrew almost entirely from the court, keeping to shadowed rooms for the rest of her life. Elizabeth had no such refuge. She was the state, and the state required a face that inspired awe, not pity. From that time forward, and with mounting urgency as the decades turned, the Queen relied upon the tools of the painter to restore what the pox had stolen. She adopted the cosmetic known as Venetian ceruse, a paste of white lead ground into vinegar, the most prized and most expensive whitening preparation of the age. Across the courts of Europe, the fashionable ideal was a skin as pale and smooth as polished marble, an unblemished whiteness that advertised a life lived far from sun and toil, and ceruse produced it better than anything else. Spread over the face, the throat, and the hands, and often glazed to a faint sheen, it buried the uneven, pitted skin beneath a flawless porcelain mask. It was also, as even the 16th century dimly understood, a corrosive poison. The slow harm that lead works upon the body that absorbs it, day after day, lay far beyond the knowledge of her physicians. But the paste was known to dry and eat at the very surface it was meant to perfect, so that the skin beneath grew coarser the more it was used, and demanded heavier coats to hide the ruin the last coat had made. Whether the accumulated poison of a lifetime of ceruse hastened Elizabeth's own decline is a question later writers have raised and no one can answer. The cause of her death was never established, and the charge that her cosmetics killed her remains speculation, not fact. What is certain is that the mask she built to hide her scars could only demand, year upon year, still more paint. Beneath the white lead, the ordinary decay of age grew harder to conceal. By the 1590s, the Queen's teeth, worn by a lifetime's fondness for sugar, that costly new luxury the wealthy consumed by the pound, had gone yellow, then black, and had begun to fall away. The evidence comes not from her enemies but from the sober diplomats admitted to her presence. André Hurol de Maes, the French ambassador who had several audiences with her in 1597, set down in his journal what he saw: a woman still formidable in mind and majestic in bearing, quick and searching in conversation, but with a long thin face and teeth gone yellow and uneven, many missing altogether, so that when she spoke quickly he could not always follow her words. A year later, the German traveler Paul Hensner, watching her pass, recorded the same blackened teeth and set them down with a foreigner's frankness, as a defect he thought the English brought upon themselves by their great appetite for sugar. Over her thinning, greying hair she wore wigs of reddish gold, the color her own hair had been in the youth the portraits refused to surrender. Tradition holds that her wardrobe kept some 80 of them, though the round figure is a later embroidery, and the honest truth is only that there were many. None of this was singular to Elizabeth. It was the ordinary fate of an old woman in a century with no dentistry and no notion of the poison in her paint. What was singular was the pressure under which she carried it, for she was not merely a great lady obliged to keep up appearances, but a living icon, forbidden by the very logic of her own myth ever to be seen to grow old, since to admit the frailty of the Queen's body was, in her subjects' minds, to admit the frailty of the kingdom itself. That fear gave rise to one of the most haunting stories of her final years, the report that she had banished every true mirror from her private rooms. It is a story worth pausing on, precisely because it is the kind of resonant image that a careful telling must weigh rather than simply repeat. Its source is thin. It rests chiefly on a remark the poet Ben Jonson made to a friend, the Scottish laird William Drummond of Hawthornden, years after the Queen was dead, that Elizabeth never saw herself after she became old in a true glass. They painted her and sometimes would vermilion her nose. It is a striking claim, and it may be true, but it is second-hand gossip from the reign after hers, set down in 1619 by a man passing on what another had told him, and some historians doubt it altogether. It is best taken for exactly what it is, a haunting tradition about the mask of uncertain truth. Whether or not she ever ordered a single glass removed, the deeper thing the anecdote gropes toward is written in paint on 100 surviving panels, a queen who had resolved that the world would see the goddess and never the woman. For while the flesh decayed, the official image was frozen by decree and by art into something that would not age at all. From about the 1590s, as Elizabeth entered her 60s, her portraiture was standardized into what art historians now call, quite literally, the mask of youth, a single approved face pattern, pioneered in the exquisite miniatures of Nicholas Hilliard and copied outward by many lesser hands that erased every wrinkle and every year. High pale brow, wide unclouded eyes, the faint arch of a serene half-smile. A queen perpetually in the bloom of her prime, laid down on panel regardless of the true chronology of the body it claimed to depict. This was no sudden impulse. As far back as 1563, her government had drafted a proclamation to forbid the circulation of unauthorized and unflattering likenesses and to fix a single approved pattern from which all others must be drawn. Unwelcome images were discouraged and some were destroyed. By the end of her life, the portraits had ceased to be likenesses in any honest sense and had become icons, instruments not of record but of control. The great set pieces of those years show the machine at its zenith. The Ditchley portrait, painted by Marcus Gierarts the Younger around 1592, sets an ageless queen astride a map of her whole kingdom, her feet planted upon the very soil of England, storm clouds breaking behind her, and clear sky opening before a monarch who is not merely young but cosmic, coextensive with the land itself. The rainbow portrait, made when she was near 70, pushes the imagery further still. There the queen is a smooth-faced young woman, crowned with symbols of wisdom and empire. A serpent of prudence coils on her sleeve, and her gown is embroidered all over with human eyes and ears, the sign of a sovereign who sees and hears everything her subjects do, the surveillance state itself woven into cloth of gold. In her hand she holds a rainbow, and the Latin motto beside it declares that there can be no rainbow without the sun of her presence. These were not portraits. They were the final perfection of a machine that had been building Gloriana for 40 years, and the wider the gap grew between the painted goddess and the tired woman in the chamber, the harder that machine was made to work. The portraits could seize the gold, the pearls, and the stiff, impenetrable architecture of the gowns, but they could not seize the solitude of the woman inside them. She had spent 40 years refining the performance of monarchy, raising a barrier of ceremony and mystery that let her hold the reins of power while keeping the whole world at arm's length. And now, as the century closed, that same barrier had begun to close around her like a cage. The advisors who had once been her partners in that work were dying off, one after another, replaced by a younger generation that regarded her less as a living queen than as an institution to be managed. The distance between the painted goddess and the old woman in the chamber was no longer merely a matter of paint and powder. The mask was perfect now, an ageless goddess, painted and powdered and hung with pearls, gazing serenely and forever young out of 100 identical portraits, while the woman beneath it grew old and tired and afraid. And in the last decade of the century, behind that flawless golden face, the aging queen made the final and most human mistake of her long life. She fell one last time for a young man. He was beautiful, brilliant, brave, and impossibly reckless, young enough to be her grandson, and he flattered her and defied her and played upon an old woman's fondness with a boldness that no one else at court would ever have dared. His name was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, and for a few dazzling years the Queen indulged him as she had indulged no one since the far-off days of Robert Dudley. She had loved a Robert at the very beginning of her reign and lost him to a death no one could explain. Now, at the end of it, she would love another Robert, and this one, the last of them, she would send to the block with her own signature on the warrant. The golden boy arrived at court trailing the kind of glamour that had not been seen since the first bright days of Robert Dudley. Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, born in 1565, was everything the weathered old councillors around the Queen were not. Tall, handsome, athletic, eloquent, and charged with a reckless, volatile energy that seemed to electrify the aging Queen's world. He was, by a strange turn of the wheel, bound to her oldest love, the stepson of Robert Dudley, for his widowed mother, Lettice Knollys, had married the Earl in a match the Queen, in her jealousy, never forgave. That old grievance hung over him from the start, and yet, for more than a decade, it seemed only to sharpen the fascination. To Elizabeth, now moving through her 50s and into her 60s, Essex was a spark of youth and danger in a palace grown heavy with the grinding business of state, and she raised him up with an extravagance that startled the whole court. She gave him military commands and a hero's opportunities. She loaded him with patronage to dispense among his followers, and most valuable of all, she granted him the farm of the customs on sweet wines, the exclusive right to tax every cask of sweet wine brought into England, which became the foundation of his fortune and the engine of his entire position. His fame was real, and a portion of it he had earned. In 1596, Essex helped to lead the daring raid on Cadiz, storming and sacking the great Spanish port in a blaze of glory that made him almost overnight the most celebrated soldier in England. Bonfires and ballads carried his name into every shire. The island's voyage against the Azores treasure fleet the following year added less to his laurels, but the image was fixed by then. Essex the paladin, the people's hero, the last flower of English chivalry. It was an image he believed utterly, and it was the seed of his undoing. For he was a man built for the tilt-yard and the battlefield, not for the shifting, patient geography of the council chamber. He was famously vain, quick to imagined insult, and constitutionally unable to endure being crossed or overlooked, and the Queen he served had spent 40 years making crossing and overlooking the very instruments of her rule. The friction turned to open rupture in 1598 in a council meeting called to settle the command against the rebellion in Ireland. When Elizabeth rejected the candidate Essex was pressing and made plain her own contrary mind, the Earl of Skye, before the assembled council, turned his back upon her in a gesture of open, insolent contempt. It was an outrage no subject offered a Tudor monarch. The Queen, her patience gone, struck him a sharp blow across the ear and told him to go and be hanged. And then came the moment that stopped the breath of every man in the room. Essex clapped his hand to the hilt of his sword. He had to be seized and physically held back, his face white with fury, swearing aloud that he would not have borne such an insult even from her father, King Henry himself. To lay a hand upon a weapon in the presence of the sovereign, against the sovereign, was a step to the very threshold of treason. And yet the Queen let it pass. She allowed him to withdraw. The quarrel was smoothed over in the record. But she had seen the man beneath the courtier, and he had drawn from the day the most dangerous lesson of his life, that he could go further than any other man alive and survive it. The final ruinous test came in 1599. Elizabeth entrusted him with the greatest chance and the greatest instrument of his career, an army of some 16,000 men, the largest force she ever sent out of England, with which to crush the long and draining rebellion of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, in Ireland. It was to be the crowning validation of the hero. It became a catastrophe. Essex squandered the army on aimless marches through the south, while disease and desertion melted it away. He lavished knighthoods on his followers against the Queen's express command. And when at last he came face to face with Tyrone, instead of giving battle, he held a private, unwitnessed parley with the rebel earl at a river ford and concluded a truce on terms the Queen found both humiliating and deeply suspect. Her letters to him crackled with anger, and then Essex did the truly unthinkable. Abandoning his post and his army without leave, he took ship for England and rode headlong across the country for the court which lay that autumn at Nonsuch Palace in Surrey. On the morning of the 28th of September, 1599, still spattered with the mud of the road, Essex flung himself through the palace and burst unannounced into the Queen's private chamber, reaching her before her ladies had begun the day's long work of reconstruction, before the wig was pinned and the ceruse laid on and the mask of the eternal goddess fixed in its place. He found what the whole apparatus of the reign existed to hide. An old woman of 66, newly risen, her thin grey hair loose about her face, undefended in the raw light of morning. She received him in that first astonishing moment with a chilling composure and gave him leave to withdraw and change his clothes. But the intimacy of that intrusion was a debt he could never repay. The mask had been torn away in an instant by the one man reckless enough to do it, and she would not forgive it. By that same evening he was under guard. His fall was swift and total. He was stripped of his offices and held through a long, wearing semi-captivity in the custody of the Lord Keeper. A special commission censured him in public in the summer of 1600 and left his honors in ruins. And then, in the autumn of that year, the Queen delivered the stroke that finished him. She refused to renew his monopoly on sweet wines. At a single blow, the source of all his income was gone, and Essex, down a man already drowning in debt, his pride flayed, his influence evaporated, was left with nothing but a burning, singular resentment. That resentment curdled into a fever dream of rescue. He gathered about him, at Essex House on the Strand, a following of the discontented, the indebted, and the ambitious, and persuaded himself that the Queen had become the prisoner of a cabal of his enemies, Robert Cecil chief among them, who had poisoned her mind against him, and that one bold stroke could sweep them away and restore him to his rightful place at her side. The plotting had a strange and telling overture. On the afternoon before the rising, a group of Essex's supporters paid the players at the Globe to stage an old and pointed drama, the tragedy of Richard II, with its scene of a lawful English king deposed from his throne. The government did not miss the meaning of the choice. On the morning of the 8th of February, 1601, Essex gambled the whole remainder of his life. With perhaps 200 armed followers, he rode out from Essex House into the streets of the City of London, crying that a plot was laid against his life and calling on the citizens to rise and arm and follow him. He was certain that the people who had cheered him after Cadiz would surge to his side. Not one of them stirred. The city stayed shuttered and silent. He was proclaimed a traitor in the streets behind him, and the rising, which had never truly begun, dissolved within a few hours into a stumbling retreat. He barricaded himself inside Essex House and surrendered that night. The trial for high treason followed with a terrible clinical speed. Essex was convicted, and this time the Queen, who had once indulged his every tantrum, signed the warrant for his death and did not draw it back. On the 25th of February, 1601, within the walls of the Tower of London, spared the public scaffold, a last courtesy to his rank, the Earl of Essex was beheaded. He was not yet 35 years old. The Queen, who had loved him, let the sentence stand. In the centuries that followed, a beautiful and enduring story grew up around that death, the legend of the ring. It held that Elizabeth had once given Essex a ring and a promise, that if ever he stood in extremity, he might send it to her and she would grant him mercy, that from his cell in the Tower he did indeed send it, and that a jealous enemy at court kept the token from ever reaching the Queen's hand, so that Elizabeth, believing he was too proud to plead, let him die, and learned the cruel truth only long afterward. It is a tale of tragic misunderstanding, and it has moved audiences for 300 years. It is also an invention. It appears in no contemporary record, It surfaces for the first time in the pages of a romantic novel published in 1695, nearly a century after both the Queen and the Earl were in their graves, and historians regard it as a pure myth with no foundation of truth. The documented reality is colder and far more consistent with the woman who had governed England for 4 decades. There was no missing ring. She signed the death of the last young man she had loved because he had made himself a traitor and a danger to the state, and she chose her throne over her own heart, exactly as she had chosen it at every crossroads of her long life. She had signed his death, as she had signed the death of a queen, and let the missionary priests go to Tyburn, and lived with her own mother's scaffold at the root of her earliest memory, because the throne always came first, and the woman always came second, and that had been the bargain of her entire life. But this time something in the old queen seemed to give way. Essex was the last of them, the last of the bright, dangerous, beloved men she had raised up and ruled over and in the end destroyed, and with him gone under the axe, the court around her began to empty and grow cold. Burghley was dead, Leicester was long dead, Walsingham was dead. The whole brilliant generation that had built her reign and her legend had gone down into the ground, one after another, and left her alone at the top of a glory that felt, more and more with every passing month, like a beautifully painted prison. She had less than 3 years left to live, and she would spend them, as she had spent so much of her long life, watchful, secretive, and utterly alone, an aging goddess wandering the galleries of a court full of ghosts, refusing to the very end to answer the one question that would decide the fate of everything she had built. Who would come after her? The death of the Earl of Essex had not been merely the execution of a favourite. It was the final, brutal severing of the last cord that bound Elizabeth to the vitality of her own youth. The man she had raised and indulged and elevated and at the last been forced to destroy was gone, and with him went the final illusion that the Queen might remain untouched by the passing of time. By the turn of the new century, the court had become a place of ghosts. One by one the giants of the Elizabethan age had been laid in the earth, and the Queen, in her loneliness, found herself the sole surviving inhabitant of a world that had moved on without her. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, had been the first of the great figures to go in the early autumn of 1588, expiring only weeks after the victory over the Armada that he had helped to secure. Elizabeth felt that loss with a depth she would not display to the world, but in the privacy of her chambers it was recorded she kept a little casket by her bedside, and in it the last letter he had ever written her, endorsed across the paper in her own sharp, decisive hand with 3 words: his last letter. She kept it there until the day she died. It was a rare, piercing crack in the armor of Gloriana, a testament to a human bond that neither the demands of state nor the discipline of her own legend had ever quite erased. 2 years later, Francis Walsingham followed him into the grave, the spymaster who had been the cold and necessary engine of her security, the man who had unraveled the treasonous ciphers of her enemies and woven the web that kept her throne intact, died in 1590, so exhausted by his service and so hollowed out by the debts he had run up in the Queen's cause that he was buried at night quietly and without ceremony, to spare his family the creditors who had hounded his final days. And in 1598 the last and greatest pillar gave way, when William Cecil, Lord Burghley, breathed his last. He had been the anchor of the entire reign, the steady, cautious, brilliant architect of her government for 40 years, at her side since her first day upon the throne. Tradition holds that in his final fading weeks, the Queen, who had scarcely performed a domestic act in her whole life, came to his bedside and fed him broth with her own hand. Whether or not the image is strictly true, it speaks to the profound sense of abandonment settling over the aging monarch. With Burghley gone, the power of the state passed into the hands of his son, Robert Cecil, as able and as calculating as his father, and the victor of the long factional war with Essex, but a man who did not share the deep, foundational history that had bound the Queen to the elder Cecil for 2 generations. The decade of the 1590s, which posterity would later drape in the shimmering golden robes of a triumphant age, was in reality a period of mounting, grinding hardship. The bright confidence of the Armada years was eroded by the harsh business of sustaining a greatness the country could barely afford. England was scourged by a run of disastrous harvests. 4 failed in succession in the middle years of the decade, that left the countryside hungry, drove the price of bread beyond the reach of the poor, and in the worst-hit corners of the north brought outright famine and death by starvation. Plague returned to the crowded streets of London, inflation gnawed at every purse, and the endless bleeding cost of maintaining armies in the Low Countries and in the rebellious, ruinous theatre of Ireland drained the treasury faster than it could be filled. Vagrants and masterless men crowded the roads. Elizabeth's popularity, once an untouchable and almost sacred thing, began to fray under the weight of ordinary grievance, nowhere more sharply than in the swelling public fury over the monopolies. These were the exclusive rights to trade in particular commodities: salt, starch, currants, playing cards, 100 small necessities, which the Queen had granted as cheap rewards to her favorites and courtiers, and which allowed the holders to fix prices at will and squeeze the ordinary buyer. It was a system that lined the pockets of the few while the many paid, and for the first time in a long reign the people were beginning openly to murmur, the aura of the Queen's benevolence chafing against the plain reality of a hungry economy. The tension reached its breaking point in the autumn of 1601, when a parliament weary of the corruption and the cost gathered in a state of genuine, simmering anger, and the grievance of the monopolies threatened to become an open confrontation between the Commons and the Crown. It was a moment that might have shattered the carefully built facade of the Virgin Queen. Instead, here in the very winter of her reign, Elizabeth summoned the last of her legendary art. On the 30th of November 1601, she received a deputation of the Commons and addressed them in what later generations would name the Golden Speech. She did not come to them with the bluster of an autocrat, but with the measured, practiced grace of a performer who had always understood that power was a kind of dialogue. She gave ground on the monopolies, promising reform, and framed the retreat not as a defeat of her will but as a proof of her love. She spoke to them of the bond between a ruler and a people that ran deeper than any quarrel over trade and gold, telling them that though God had raised her high and set a crown upon her head, she counted the glory of her reign to be that she had reigned with their love and had ever held herself the servant of her subjects' good. It was a masterpiece of political stagecraft, so moving in its delivery that the members were reportedly left in tears, their anger dissolved by the sheer force of her presence. But to those who stood near her, it had the unmistakable weight of a farewell. The Queen was frail, her voice grown thin, and the mask of youth she had maintained for so long was trembling now at its edges. Through all of it she remained steadfastly, and to some minds cruelly, silent upon the one matter that most consumed the nation: the succession. It was the question that terrified the whole kingdom, the single uncertainty that kept the gears of ambition turning in the dark, and still she refused to name an heir. To name a successor, in her reasoning, was to raise a rising sun that would at once draw the gaze of every restless lord and every hungry sycophant away from the throne she still occupied, to create a rival court and a magnet for every plot. She knew the danger from the inside, for she had spent her own youth as exactly such a focus of dangerous hope, and had twice stood within reach of the axe on account of it. She would not now become the architect of her own eclipse. And so, while she publicly rebuffed all talk of an heir and held to her lifelong watchword, "Video et taceo," I see and keep silent, the machinery of state had already begun, behind her back, to pivot toward the future. Robert Cecil, ever the pragmatist, had quietly opened a secret and carefully coded correspondence with the man who must in the course of nature succeed her, James VI of Scotland, the son of that other queen whose execution at Fotheringhay had been the most harrowing decision of Elizabeth's life. While his mistress held the throne and forbade the subject to be raised, Cecil was already smoothing, in the shadows, the transition to the son of the woman she had sent to the block. The final descent was marked by a deepening, impenetrable melancholy. The vibrant, sharp-witted woman who had danced through the political minefields of Europe for 4 decades seemed slowly to be withdrawing from the world of the living. She grew restless and could not sleep, and was seen pacing the long, draughty galleries of her palaces at Richmond and Whitehall in the dead of night. There were whispers, never substantiated yet persistent, that she was haunted by the faces of those she had sent to their deaths, and at times, it was said, she carried an old sword about with her, as though against an enemy that no longer existed, or as a talisman against the encroaching silence. About this time, too, the coronation ring that had been set upon her finger at Westminster 44 years before, the ring she had never once removed, and which had grown so deep into the flesh that a goldsmith had at last to be sent for to file it away, was taken from her hand. And there were those who read the severing of that ring, the token of her marriage to England, as an omen that the Queen was being parted from her kingdom at last. The woman who had once been the sun around which all of Europe turned was fading into a solitary spectral figure, shut inside the rigid cage of her own legend. And in the first cold months of 1603, the constitution that had defied every odd for so long began at last to fail entirely, and with it the careful painted illusion of a queen who would never grow old. In March of 1603, the woman who had ruled England for 44 years, who had outlived her enemies and her friends and very nearly her whole age, lay down for the last time and would not rise again. She refused her bed. She sat instead upon cushions on the floor of her chamber, day after day, silent and sleepless, one finger sometimes pressed to her mouth, staring at nothing, while her women watched and could do nothing. The most watched, most painted, most mythologized woman in the world was dying exactly as she had lived, guarded, unreadable, alone, giving nothing of herself away even now. And still, in those last silent hours, the great unanswered question of her whole reign hung unspoken in the darkening room. Who would follow her, while outside, in the cold, men on fast horses were already waiting by the gates, ready to gallop north the instant she was gone, to carry the news to a king in Scotland, and to begin the final and most enduring work of all, the turning of a difficult, frightened, secretive, ruthless, and extraordinary woman into the golden, deathless legend of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the greatest of them all. At last the long vigil upon the cushions ended. Somewhere in the exhausted quiet of those final days, the Queen sank into a heavy stupor, and her women could not rouse her. The silence that had defined her reign, that cool, impenetrable stillness she had used to baffle ambassadors and hold her own council at bay, had finally become absolute. In the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, the last of the Tudors passed from that stillness into the final one. She was 69 years old, the woman who had been born into a world of expectation and disappointment, who had lived her entire life beneath the threat of the axe, had simply worn away. There were no ringing final proclamations. The story that, being past speech, she traced a circle with her fingers above her head to name James of Scotland, her heir, is a tradition recorded by those who wished to see the succession blessed. She may have gestured her assent, or the councillors gathered about her bed may simply have supplied the answer they had already arranged. And the famous deathbed line, that she would give all her possessions for a moment of time, is nothing but a later invention, a fable grafted onto her end by those who could not bear to imagine her dying in silence. The truth was far quieter and far more consistent with the life she had led. She died as she had lived, in a house she had made a fortress, leaving the world to guess at what passed behind her eyes in those final, wordless days. Within hours, the machinery of state moved with the precision she had spent 44 years refining. James was proclaimed in London before the morning was old. The transition was seamless, and the chaos that had been the great, gnawing fear of the English people for 4 decades never came at all. Robert Cecil, the son of her most trusted minister, had spent years in secret, coded correspondence with the Scottish king to ensure that when the thread finally snapped, the kingdom would not fall into the abyss of a disputed throne, and his patient work in the shadows now delivered exactly what it had promised. She was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 28th of April, 1603, her coffin drawn through streets thronged with mourners behind a painted effigy of the Queen in her robes, and a great cry, it was said, went up from the crowd. In time, her cousin James, the son of the very woman she had sent to the block at Fotheringhay, laid her beneath a monument that defied the old jagged divisions of her reign. She was entombed together with her half-sister Mary Tudor, the Catholic queen who had once held her a prisoner in the Tower. 2 sisters, one Protestant and one Catholic, one who had sought to turn back the clock and one who had steered the ship into a new and uncertain age, were brought to rest under a single stone and a single inscription which spoke of them sleeping together in the one hope of resurrection. It was a final, ironic harmony for a life that had been a long and calculated struggle against the very forces that sought to divide it. Yet, even as they lowered her into the earth, the work of building the legend was already all but finished. The Gloriana we know, the Virgin Queen, the Golden Goddess, the Mother of the Nation, was never the simple verdict of grateful history. It was a masterwork of political architecture designed to outlast the flesh. It had begun the moment she took the throne, in the controlled and flattened perfection of her portraits, where the mask of youth was painted over the scars of disease and time, and the emblem of the sieve, held in a virgin's hand, became a holy sign of her refusal ever to be owned. It grew through the yearly pageantry of Accession Day, the 17th of November, a state-sponsored cult that turned the anniversary of her accession into a secular feast to stand where the banished holy days had been. And it reached its height in the verse of Edmund Spenser, who in his vast epic The Faerie Queene did not merely praise her but enthroned her under that very name as the immortal Gloriana herself, transmuting a woman's solitude into a sacred mystery of state. After her death, the legend only burned the brighter. The Stuart kings who followed came to seem, to English eyes, flawed and distant and spendthrift, and in the shadow of their failures, the age of Elizabeth began to shimmer with the golden light of a lost paradise. Nostalgia is a ruthless editor. It quietly scrubbed away the surveillance state, the priests racked and hanged and quartered at Tyburn, the crushed Catholics, the sailors left to die of fever and hunger in the streets of the port towns for want of their pay, the cold and famished misery of the 1590s. In their place it left only the glory, the defiance of the Armada, the wind that scattered Spain, the glittering wit of the new theatres. Gloriana was, in every sense that matters, the single greatest work of art that the Tudor century ever produced, and 4 centuries later, we are still half living inside the frame. We must hold both truths, for they are inseparable. We cannot dismiss the reality of what she achieved. Elizabeth was, by any measure, a formidable ruler. She inherited a kingdom that was poor, faction-ridden, bankrupt from war, and dangerously isolated, and she held it together for 44 years and left it a power that dared to look across the oceans. She navigated the treacherous straits between the old faith and the new with a pragmatism that spared England the kind of ruinous religious civil war that tore France apart during her own lifetime. She possessed a brilliance of mind and nerve that allowed her to outweight and outmaneuver the most powerful men in Europe, and a resilience that would have shattered a lesser spirit long before. She kept her own counsel and her own power in a world that told her every day that a woman could hold neither. And she presided over a genuine flowering Shakespeare and Marlowe and Spenser, the first long reach of English ships across the sea that has borne her name ever since. All of that is true, and it is a legacy that commands respect. She was not the passive icon of the portraits, she was the architect of her own survival, but the darkness she left behind is just as real, and it is the shadow that gives the light its shape. The woman who stood at the center of this golden age was a creature of trauma, forged in the fires of a childhood in which her mother was beheaded and her own life became a bargaining chip for ambitious men. That terror never truly left her. It transformed her into a ruler who governed by the surveillance of Francis Walsingham's codebreakers and the finality of the scaffold. She did not merely rule, she controlled. She kept her kingdom in a state of perpetual anxious suspense, refusing to marry, refusing to name an heir, refusing to give any man a handle upon her power. She signed the death warrant of the Scottish Queen not with a flourish but through a long series of agonizing delays and bureaucratic shadow plays, and then she systematically broke the servant who had dared to carry out the order she had given. She sent the missionary priests of the Catholic faith to their deaths in the name of a state that claimed the right to police the very souls of its subjects. She presided over the ruin of the last man she ever dared to love, and she watched from behind the white lead paint of her mask as the world she had mastered grew old and tired around her. She was not a monster. She lived in an age of monsters, and was often the most restrained among them, but she was a woman of iron, and she paid for her power with the loss of her own peace. The golden legend of Gloriana is beautiful, but it is not the woman. It is the story the palace wanted the world to tell, a mask crafted to hide the scars and the cold, calculating heart of a survivor who never once forgot the scent of blood upon the scaffold. The truth is far stranger and far more human. It is the story of a girl who was branded a bastard and a threat before she could walk, and who spent her whole life proving that she was the only person in the kingdom who could be trusted with its survival. It is the story of a ruler who built a golden age out of the wreckage of her own family, and who found that, in the end, the gold was the only thing that could survive the scrutiny of time. The legend and the woman were two halves of a single whole, bound together by a will that refused to be broken. She died an old woman, alone and silent on the floor of her chamber, and she won anyway, because the last and greatest thing Elizabeth Tudor ever conquered was not Spain, and not her enemies, and not even her own hard fate, but the memory of the world, and that conquest has never once been reversed. The legend she and her servants built across a lifetime is the one we still carry. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the golden goddess of a golden age, the greatest of the monarchs of England. And it is a beautiful story, and it is not the truth. The truth is larger, and it is darker, and it refuses to resolve into a heroine or a tyrant. She gave a small and frightened kingdom 44 years of survival and a confidence that outlasted her by centuries. She held her own power and her own silence in a world that swore a woman could hold neither. And in the very same reign, with the very same iron will, she built a state to watch and break her own people, sent a queen and 100 priests and the last man she loved to their deaths, and painted a golden mask over a scarred and frightened face, and made the whole world call it beauty. The formidable queen was real, so was the frightened child who never left her. So was the ruthlessness and the vanity and the fear and the endless brilliant lie of the golden legend. And the truest thing that can be said of Elizabeth I, when the mask is finally lifted, is that she was all of it at once. Not the goddess of the portraits and not the villain of the whispers, but a single, extraordinary and wholly human woman, far stranger and far darker than the shining legend the palace built to bury her.